IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. That dude over there who's got to get that camera down a little bit. He's a little hiding there at the bottom of the camera. That is Brian Smith. Y'all know Brian Smith. He has been around on this channel plenty of times in the past, and Brian is actually going to. He and I finally worked it out. We've been working on this Brian? Probably 2 years, just kind of working out the details and where are you going to live and. Finally got settled in Florida. So Brian is going to be launching a new show on CFB Nation. He's going to be covering Southeastern recruiting. We're going to start having him on some different shows here. We'll be going on with him. He'll be part of some of the CFB Nation channel shows that I'll be having there as well. And then I saw him just kind of lurking in the chat, just listening, because as y'all know, Brian is at his heart a Notre Dame fan. And so saw him then. I was like, you know what? If you're just going to be hanging out during the show, why don't you come on with me? And we'll talk a little Notre Dame defensive line. So I got him with me today. Got my man Ryan Roberts kind of working backside production. He's going to be getting some mailbag stuff going on. So we are ready to rock and roll today, Brian, because I wanted to have you on because I would argue there's probably no position you like to talk about more when it comes to Notre Dame than defensive line, with cornerback a close second. But
those are facts. Those are facts.
So,
for all the wrong reasons, those are true.
Right. So we're going to talk about the Notre Dame defensive line today, Brian, as we continue our 2023 season preview. We will have a mailbag at the end. As I said, my guy Ryan Roberts is on the back end. He just put his babies down for nap, so he's able to chill on the back end, getting questions. So bring those up during the mailbag. If y'all haven't seen, Ryan's got a ton of updates on the Irish Breakdown website the last couple of days. He's got an update today on a really talented safety. Could maybe be a rover from California, Matai Tagoa. Really talented. Actually, he's not from California. I'm sorry, he's from Nevada. Had a great update yesterday on California linebacker Noah McHale, who is an absolute dude in the 25 class. And he also has an update this morning on a name y'all will know, and that is Nathaniel Owusu-Boateng, who basically told Ryan that right now 4 schools are standing above the others, and one of those 4 is Notre Dame. So as we've said to y'all before, the 2025 linebacker class is loaded, and Ryan has had a lot of updates on those this past week. So make sure you're checking that out as well. But Brian, today the defensive line is going to be the topic of conversation, because as we look at Notre Dame, when we talk about what this team can be and the expectations for this team, there are certain things that we feel confident about as a analyst covering this team. I feel very good about the offense, and I know that receivers got to do this and that and the other, but I'm very confident that unit is going to play well. I had an article out today that was another part of my Marcus Freeman interview. I was going to get it up tonight, ended up getting it up this morning, where Coach Freeman and I talked about the expanded pass game, and there's just a lot of optimism on my end that the offense is going to be pretty good, because they're going to have a really good offensive line, they're going to have a really good quarterback, really good running back, and there's at least talent on the perimeter. I expect that the cornerbacks are going to be really good this year, pending good health. I think the safeties will at least be solid, pending good health, with some of the additions that they had, and Xavier Watts. And basically, they were solid last year, and they got everybody coming back that played solid football last year. The question, however, Brian, and we can talk about improved linebacker play and cornerbacks and safeties and transfers and Sam Hartman and all these other things. At the end of the day, if Notre Dame wants to be a championship caliber football team, if they want to be a team that can go to the playoff, that can win against Ohio State, USC, Clemson, run the table, get to the postseason, compete with Georgia, compete with Bama, compete with those teams, their defensive line is going to have to be really, really good. There's the potential for it. They flashed it at times last year, but at the end of the day, when you look at the season, this is a unit that has to play better than it did last year. It has to be more productive than it was last year, and it has to be more consistent than it was last year, and it has to do all that without the best player that they had from last season. So we're going to dive into all that today, Brian, but there's no question about it. For the good that the defensive line did last year at times, the reality is they weren't good enough in a lot of different ways we'll kind of get into statistically. But the big thing for me last year, Brian, was in 2018 to 2022, you compare those two lines, the 2022 defensive line actually produced more sacks and the same number of tackles for loss as the 2018 defensive line. But here's the difference. The 2018 defensive line was money. They stepped up in big games. They stepped up in clutch moments. They made game-winning plays. Last year's defensive line, there was a lot of stat stuffing feel to what they did, and they weren't stepping up in the big moments. They didn't play very well against Ohio State. At least the best players didn't. They didn't play great against USC. They didn't play great in some of the other games. They weren't able to make the big stops when they needed to against Marshall and Stanford. And so it's going to have to play better. They did not play championship caliber football last year. They're going to need to do that this season. It's a very, very important position.
I will be surprised if they don't step up, at least in the bigger games. I know that you and I had talked about that last year during the season. Clemson game, I think they did a pretty good job. That was probably the best one that they stepped up. But the consistency, especially against USC, I mean, nobody tackled a certain quarterback very well last year across the country, but that game was probably the most frustrating for me. Like, they had too many chances to make game-changing plays and missed. And those are just on players. Those are one-on-ones and stuff that they missed. Not just chasing the quarterback, but against the running game too. So which guy or guys ends up dominating even for a quarter in a big game or something like that could be the difference between Notre Dame going to a decent bowl game like the Gator Bowl, which I went to last year, or going to the college football playoff. A handful of plays. So I hope that it's the latter, because while I like the Gator Bowl, I would much rather watch on my TV some championship level game.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt. So when you look at this unit needing to improve, Brian, I think there's a couple areas that I've identified as where the production needs to be. And the first one is kind of big picture. It's just be more consistent, right? It's from a series to series, snap to snap, game to game standpoint. There just needs to be more consistency. I think when you look at last year's unit, Brian, it's kind of an interesting unit because there was like the veterans, there was the Adamiolas, there was Isaiah Foskey, there was Howard Cross, and then there was a bunch of kids who'd never played before, or at least played on this level. You had Chris Smith coming over from Harvard. You had Gabriel Rubio really in his first year in the rotation. You had you had Jordan Botelho who moved over from Rover from the previous year. So you had this big gap in between the experienced guys and then the not experienced guys. Well, coming into this season, there's a lot more experienced guys, even though that they're not necessarily proven to the degree that Isaiah Foskey was last season. So just consistency is going to be a big thing, and block things like block destruction and technique, things like that, just being more consistent with it. But the big thing for me, Ryan, is this unit has to be more disruptive in the run game. That's going to be a big key for me. And I've got a couple stats for you.
Let's hear it.
When you talk about the play of the defensive line and the production of the defensive line, here's how they stack up. Last year, Notre Dame's defensive linemen accounted for 46.5 tackles for loss and 29 sacks. Notre Dame's 2018 defense, their defensive line had 46.5 tackles for loss, same as the 22 unit, 26 sacks, so fewer sacks. If you look at Ohio State's defensive line last year, 48.5 tackles for loss, 24 sacks. Notre Dame's defensive linemen had more production than Michigan's defensive line last year. But here's where, to me, they need to get to, because a lot of the teams that we just talked about, especially Ohio State, their defense was good, but they had a similar problem to Notre Dame. They didn't step up in the big games, the big moments. Then you look at Clemson's defensive line, and Clemson's defensive line last year, they had 26 sacks, which is 3 fewer than Notre Dame's, but they had 56.5 tackles for loss. And when you look at it, to me, it's those run game numbers. The sack numbers were good last year. Now we'll get into some questions about sack production this year, because 11 of those 29 sacks were from one dude. But the reality is to me, Brian, you need a much greater gap between your sack production and your run game production. So if you look at the 2018 defense, number one, that was a far less aggressive defense. Clark Lee was very much a do your job type of defense. So the fact that the production was equal to what the 22 defense was, which was much more of an attacking defense, is actually not a good thing. You look at Ohio State, for example, 24 sacks, that's 5 fewer than Notre Dame's defensive line. But they had 2 more tackles for loss, which means there was a bigger gap in the run game production between the two. So Ohio State had 24.5 more run stops than they did sacks. Notre Dame only had 17.5. There was a 20 difference gap in the 2018 defensive line. Clemson had a 30 gap between the number of sacks and the number of tackles for loss, run game stops. So you had 26 sacks and 30 run game stops. And so Notre Dame, again, 17.5. So that's the big thing for me, Brian, when I look at it is they have to be more. I actually think this team with Riley Mills stepping in the starting lineup and Jordan Botelho and Javonte Jean-Baptiste, I'm actually pretty confident in the pass game, which we'll get to here in a little bit. The big question for me is, can this unit be more productive and disruptive in the run game? That's going to be a big key because, Brian, as much as football has changed, when you get to the postseason, it still comes down to who can run the ball and who can stop the run. And if you don't believe me, go look at Ohio State and Georgia last year. Fourth quarter, Ohio State couldn't run the football. They became one-dimensional. Once Marvin Harrison goes out, they couldn't do what they needed to do to win because they couldn't rely on their run game. In the postseason, you still need to be able to run the ball and stop the run. Doesn't mean you got to run for 250 yards, but when you need to be able to run the football. And the team that can run the football and stop the run, TCU ran all over Michigan last year. Michigan had a harder time running the ball against TCU. That was a big part of that game. Now, more pressure gets put on J.J. McCarthy. He wasn't ready for it. Michigan gets beat in the postseason. That's really what it comes down to. And that's probably right now, Brian, my biggest big picture question is, can this unit take a big jump in run game production?
I think your answer there will be dependent upon the following question. Can anybody on the interior consistently command a double team? That's about as generic as it gets. But right now, if you're Ohio State or Clemson or something, are you really scared of anybody Notre Dame has on the interior?
Right now, no. And that's going to be a big question mark. And we'll get into some of the specific players here in a little bit, Brian. But here's the reality of what Notre Dame is going to have to figure out what they're going to do this year. And that comes down to basically, you don't have a Jordan Davis. You don't have a Jalen Carter. So you've got to properly use the big guys you have, guys like Gabriel Rubio and Aiden Canaana in certain situations. But as you know, there's two ways to occupy two blockers. One is to be Lewis Nix. The other is to be a quick penetrator and attacking. And that's something that when you watch Al Golden's defense last year, there was way too much asking smaller players to kind of stalemate and try to hold at the point of attack. And then that allowed them to kind of, I mean, they actually held up pretty well at the point. But Brian, and you and I both know, when you're undersized and you're stalemating, you're gonna get beat by the better teams in your schedule. Right? You need to reset the line of scrimmage in your favor. That's what offensive line play and defensive line play is all about. Who can reset the line of scrimmage in their favor? The offense is trying to get vertical. The defense is trying to get vertical the other direction. And so will Al Golden look at his defensive line and say, you know what? I don't have Lewis Nix. I don't have Justin Scott. I don't have Jalen Carter. But here's what I have. I have a really fast and athletic nose tackle in Howard Cross. I have a very athletic kid in Riley Mills who played on the edge for us last year. I have Jason Onye, who's a pretty quick penetrating athlete up the middle. Gabriel Rubio is a pretty quality athlete for his size. I got some kids that can move. So does he turn them loose a little bit more, or does he continue to try to use the defensive line to set up plays for the linebackers? Because for all the heat that the linebackers took last year, the fact is that the defensive line could not occupy, to your point, Brian, the blockers and keep the blockers at the front level the way that they needed to allow the linebackers to run free. So if you're going to have a defensive line or defensive scheme that is linebacker driven from a production standpoint, you have to have a defensive line that can keep the blockers occupied. And that's going to be the question. And to me, it's as much about Al Golden as it is about the talent, because it comes down to, are you going to just run your scheme, or are you going to design your scheme to better suit the players? Now, here's something that's interesting, Brian. A big part of what we saw in the spring from Notre Dame was a very aggressive, attacking, blitzing type of defense that suits the defensive line, in my opinion.
Well, they don't have a bunch of two-gappers. You know, I just did a highlight on another show about a kid that Florida took out of Georgia that just lost a bunch of weight and is down to 348. Notre Dame doesn't have that guy on their roster. You know what I mean? I can't imagine being that big, by the way. But at the same time, Notre Dame can still, I think Howard Cross is a great football player, but if he's not just shooting the gap, he's not holding the point against a 315 guy. It's just not going to happen very often. He's a great player, but what do you think Cross weighs? 270?
Yeah.
Give or take?
They list him at 275 because I think he shows up at fall camp at 275, but you and I both know he's not 275 by the time the season's end.
He's 268, 266, something like that by the time they get to the USC or Stanford game. Yeah, it's part of the process. So if you're going to blitz and be aggressive, he does fit the scheme.
Yeah.
So that's okay. But
as does Riley Mills, as does Jason Onye, as does Gabriel Rubio. There's no question about it. So here's an interesting part about this too, Brian, when you look at it. This is a big year for Al Washington as a defensive line coach. Now, I'll just come out and say it. I'm giving him a mulligan on year one because the fact of the matter is there just were some veteran guys that would just not buy in. When I watched Coach Washington during the spring with his unit, watching them coach, I'm trying to remember the name of the GA, but very active guy, very heavily involved in helping coach too. And I'm a believer, Brian, that every team should have a really good O-line and D-line graduate assistant.
Oh, gosh.
Because those are the two highest volume numbers on your roster. I mean, it'd be different if like you had one DB coach, then you need a GA there as well. But you need a D-line GA that's good. Mike Elston had some very good D-line GAs. Harry Heastand had some very good O-line GAs. That's an imperative thing. That's an important thing to have. And I've heard good things about this new guy, but I'm watching them, and the kids were far. You can watch it, Brian. You've been to enough camps. You've been to enough practices. You can see when kids are really locked into what a coach is saying because are the kids who aren't taking the rep paying attention. And when you watched in the spring and Coach Washington's looking at Howard Cross coaching him up or Riley Mills or Javonte Jean-Baptiste, everybody was stopped and their eyes were on the coach that was talking to him. And that to me that means something to me. That tells me, okay, this group is buying in and they're locked in and they're taking what he's saying. And I think that's something that was very important for Coach Freeman. Behind the scenes, there were some things that he did to show the unit, this is the dude, you better listen to him last season. We'll just leave it at that. So I think we're not going to be able to use that as an excuse in 2023, Brian. I think there will be some buy-in. So now it's up to Coach Washington to say, hey, look, man, you were given a group with some pretty talented young players, some veterans that have potential. It's now your job to turn this potential into production. And that's going to be a big key because I know he's catching a lot of heat on recruiting. Some of it justified, some of it, okay, it's still looking on last year. There's some things he's done well this year. The end recruiting, got to get Justin Scott. We'll talk about all the recruiting stuff. But he's going to play a huge role in determining just how good this defense is going to be this year by his ability to not only get the veterans to buy in and play to their potential, but to get the Josh Burnhams, the Junior Tuialamakas, the Tyson Fords, the Jason Onyes, the Gabriel Rubios, the Donovan Heinishes, to get those guys to start getting closer to their potential as well. If he can do that, then this defensive line has a chance to be really, really good because they can just throw waves at you. And that's going to be a big part of it, of that's going to determine the success of the defensive line this year.
To that point, and I told you this before the show, I was going to ask you kind of an off-kilter question. Take the two starters out of the mix at inside nose guard and D tackle. Which player in the backup ranks, you can pick any of them, or players if you want, will be the most disruptive off the bench along the interior, and why?
So interior guys, I think if I had to look at where the defense is right now, what we saw in the spring, it'd be Jason Onye. And that's a guy, Brian, you and I talked a lot about when he was in high school.
Yes, we did.
And you look at this kid and you're like, boy, this guy's got length. He's got athleticism. He's a former basketball player. He's a guy that had a really good spring. I think him and Rubio, but here's the thing. I saw Rubio take a step towards being the guy that we thought he could be. You know, he was a top 100 guy. I know you were working with John Garcia on the SI 99 back then. And he was a guy that ranked in the top 100 on that. He was top 100 guy by several people. I think he's a guy also, Brian, that showed that potential this year. And that's the key for me is you can't just have one guy off the bench that can be productive. You don't want guys coming in and just being, okay, you're there, right? You're there. You're eating up space. You're taking reps, right? And you're giving Riley Mills a breather. You're giving Howard Cross a breather. No, the best defensive lines, when the backup comes in, he's saying, okay, now you've got to deal with me. And I think that's something that Notre Dame needs. And they haven't always had that in recent seasons. They've had decent starters, but the backups were just guys that ate up snaps. When you look at those two guys, when you look at Donovan Heinisch, I mean, Donovan's basically a more athletic version of Kurt. And that's basically what he is. And when you look at Tyson Ford, that's going to be a big one for Bryant for Al Washington is Tyson Ford. Obviously, Jason Onye, Gabriel Rubio, those guys are going into years 3 and 4. That's an important one. Tyson Ford is an incredibly gifted player, but I think he's very immature. He's young, he's still a teenager. His game is very immature. He just got by on a lot of talent. I think that he's a guy that Al Washington needs to say, hey, look, you're my pet project. Because this is a tendency some coaches have. I got some talented players coming in. I got this young guy. He maybe wasn't what I wanted to be as a freshman, so I'm just going to move on and go to my younger group. Or you say, man, this kid's got some talent. When he flashes, it's really good. And so you make him your pet project. And he would be the guy that I would, if I'm Marcus Freeman, I would sit down with their Notre Dame's defensive GA. And I'm going to try to find his name here real quick because I don't want to just keep saying the defensive GA this year, but I'm going to try to find his name here real quick. But when you look at the staff and you look at that's not who I'm talking about, Ryan. There's another guy, and I'll try to find out who that is. But when you're looking at the defensive line and you look at the GAs, right? You say, hey, listen, you want to get a great recommendation leaving here? You want me to tell other Division I schools that you're ready to take on your own job? Here's your task. Here's your one goal. See that kid right there, number 95, Tyson Ford? Help me turn him into a player. He's your pet project. And you give him a couple guys like that. Like, that's your guy. You get that kid ready to play, and you're going to be able to write your own ticket. And I think those are things that are going to determine how good this team can be this year. I mean, at the end of the day, yeah, we can talk about all types of different things about this team, and this has got to do well, and that's got to play well, and this has got to do that, and all these other things, right, Brian? But at the end of the day, it's can you turn your talent into potential? And there's a lot of talent on this football team. The question is are we going to keep talking about the talent and the potential, or are we going to finally start to see some production? And when you get down to the younger players, that's going to be a big part of what we need to see. Is we need to see this team show that they're capable of turning that. And so that's a big question about Al Washington right now is, can you, at the very least, I think he's going to be good at what Mike Elson was good at. Mike Elson was really good at teaching the basics.
Yes, he was.
Hey, and those guys were really steady and they were really solid. If he can at least do that, then they're going to be fine. And then the question is, can you take it to that next level to where you maybe teach them a counter move and those type of things? And those are going to be the different aspects of what I want to see from this defensive line and this coaching staff.
I'm really curious about your point about counter moves and all that. I remember talking to Tyson Ford at the end of his junior year. I was on the phone with him, like, how much do you weigh right now? And he said 220. He's 290 now, give or take. Right. I don't know what, that's a lot of weight. But I watched the spring game too, and I'm like, look, you can list him as a quote-unquote third-team player. That is not a third-team player. Like the way he's moving and the athleticism and the size, that's a kid that can play at Georgia. 6'5" kids that are 290 and can make lateral movements. And by the way, kids like that are what they brought in against TCU in the title game and wiped the floor with TCU because they got tired, and Georgia was rotating guys in that had played 50% of the snaps that TCU had at the point of the year, and TCU is just done.
Right.
That's the difference between winning championships and kind of coming close. It's just depth that are, guys that are in the wings. But they were also coached up. I mean, Georgia, you and I talk about this all the time. They don't just recruit well. They develop their kids freshmen.
Yes.
And when they come in, it's not this, let's just see how this kid plays. He's already coached up by the end.
That was the overlooked thing about Alabama's title run under Saban from 2009 to like 16. 15, right? Is they were so well coached. And that's a very underrated part of what has worked at Georgia. Yes, they're talented. I get all that. They're talented, but they develop those players. And it's Ashton Derrico is the name of the defensive line coach that I'm talking about, because he primarily seems to work with the defensive tackles is when we see him in practice. So that's why I talk about him with Tyson Ford and those kind of players. So that's going to be a big part, Brian, is development. Can the development get there? Because there's no look. Do they have Georgia's talent level? I don't think so. Do they have SEC talent at several spots on this defensive line? Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Absolutely, they do. It's can you turn it into production on Saturdays? That's going to be a big key.
I hope they can do that in consistency, though. Like you were saying, in big games, we didn't see it enough last year. So I just wanted to reiterate that.
So let's look at the veterans, Brian. I think obviously we look at some of these veteran players and what we expect them to be this year. And the reality is Howard Cross needs to be able to do what he does, but stay healthy stay how do I say it? Not stay healthy, but he would wear down as the season went on because he's undersized. So part of that's on the coaches to not give him as much work as you gave him last year and maybe pick and choose. Like for me, Howard Cross is playing 15 snaps against Tennessee State, 20 against Central Michigan, because I want him to play 50 against Ohio State, right? That's my thing, you know.
That's important, man. It really is.
Right. So Howard Cross needs to just keep doing what you're doing. There's other guys, however, that to me need to step up and be better and be more consistently effective. And the first one for me is Riley Mills. Now, what's funny is a lot of people talk about Riley Mills like he hasn't done a whole lot. He was 4th on the defense last year in tackles for loss. And he, as I've said before, he's got more sacks going into his senior year than Sheldon Day or Jerry Tillery had going into their senior years. Like Riley's done some things. What he hasn't done is live up to the potential. He was also 3rd on the defense last year in sacks. He hasn't lived up to the potential of being that guy consistently, Brian. And that's going to be the big thing for Riley Mills. You and I talked a little bit about this before because Riley wanted to be an end, right? You and I were talking about this. You had a chance to talk with him last offseason at the gym. The key is he has bought in to being an inside guy. That's huge because
yes, it is.
If you're going to run the defense that I think they want to run, Riley's a 3 technique. If you're going to run, like, for example, if Clark Lee was still the defensive coordinator, I'm still having Riley as my big end. I am. And Javonte Jean-Baptiste is a Viper. That based on how Clark Lee ran his defense. The way that they ran their defense this past year, and the way that they ran it in the spring especially, you want to go with the old Lou Holtz philosophy. Take linebackers, turn them into ends. Take ends, turn them into tackles. Take 3 techniques and turn them into nose tackles. That's basically what Notre Dame is doing. And so you put Riley at 3 technique, and during the spring, we saw more consistency of him making plays. He's an important piece to this, Brian, because he's 6'5". He's about 300 pounds now. He's athletic. He's got long arms. You've seen him. He's a massive kid. I mean, he is a big, strong country boy. He's the kind of kid, Brian, that 25 years ago was a stud 3 technique for Nebraska in the mid-90s.
Oh, that's a tremendous comparison. They always had some big white guy in the middle that was really athletic that nobody else recruited outside of a couple of schools and knew about.
And looked like he lived in the weight room, which Riley does.
He was from a 2A high school in Kansas or something, and they found a way to get him to be good, or he was a part of their walk-on program or something. Yeah, they did a great job with that.
So Riley's now got to step up and be a more productive guy, Brian. He's got to do it in big games, and that's something we haven't seen. I thought one of the most disappointing aspects of the Ohio State game last year is outside of Howard Cross, who I actually thought was pretty good in that game. I thought the rest of the defensive line was incredibly disappointing, especially the veterans. I thought Riley Mills played pretty well in that game, and I thought Howard Cross played pretty well in that game, and Chris Smith I thought played pretty well in that game. I thought the other big names, Isaiah Foskey was bad in that game. Jason Adamiola got his butt kicked in that game. Justin Adamiola got his butt kicked in that game. I thought the veterans did not play well. So we need to see a different scenario this year with those guys. And so I think Riley Mills has got a chance to be that guy. If Riley Mills, Brian, plays this potential this year, that alone right there is going to make the interior of this defensive line very, very good. Because if Rubio and Onye are just solid backups and Howard Cross is just who he was last year, Riley Mills playing his potential makes this an outstanding interior defensive line.
I think he could be a 7 or 8 sack guy. I think he could be. He could be. I mean, especially with the first few games being who they are and depending on how many snaps he could be at like 4 sacks after 2 or 3 games too. So that's something else to think about. I don't think too many guys, no offense to Tennessee State, but they're not going to have anybody going to handle Riley if he's motivated. So does he have a chance in a 1 gap get up the field scheme? 100%. Now, not only do I want him to be able to do that, but when he does get double teams, guess what? That means Howard Cross has one guy on him, maybe even the guy snapping the ball, and good luck to him. So there's
Or
different
the
ways.
linebackers are running through
I mean,
untouched. Right.
I mean, J.D. Bertrand, I know he takes a beating on various Notre Dame message boards. He's a good football player.
Yeah.
I mean, let's just get it out of the way. But he is a very good blitzer, too. He times things up. He knows how to work with guys. He'll shoot a gap, take some chances, but he's fast enough, unbeknownst to some Notre Dame fans, that he can get there and make a play in the backfield. So these things play off of each other, and that's what Cincinnati did. I mean, they didn't have Jalen Carter on Cincinnati's defensive line. Like, that I'm familiar with Apopka's high school, but we all knew when he was coming out of high school, like, he is not going to sit the bench at Georgia very long. Like, he was their most physically gifted guy pretty much from the middle of his freshman year on. They don't have that guy, but they got enough moving parts up front and enough depth now, hypothetically, where the linebackers should have more free flow into the backfield. If we don't see more plays in the backfield, by the end of game 2, we're going to have a very nasty Brian Smith on this show. I will not be happy. By then, we should be able to say, hey, this looks totally different.
And Mills is the key to that. Riley Mills is the key to that.
He's got to draw double teams just like Cross does.
He's the one NFL caliber talent that can do that, Brian, with his size and his athleticism. That's the difference. Like Howard Cross can do it with quickness. Riley Mills, when he's playing his game, can anchor relatively well. Right, he's not going to look like Lewis Nix reincarnated, but he can hold his water. And now that you're older, you're stronger. Last year's by far the most playing time he got. He can be that kind of guy. But then he also needs to be able to use his athleticism. Like, what I don't want to see is them just try to turn him into a two-gapper. Like, I don't want to see that. You need to use his athleticism. So Riley Mills has got to step up, and they got to use him correctly. Then the other equation of this is the guy that's going to be next to him in the starting lineup to the outside, and that's Jordan Botelho. Jordan Botelho is a very interesting player, Brian, because fans love him for 2 reasons. Number 1, he's a highly ranked kid coming to high school. Well, really 3 reasons. Number 2, he's a little off, and I think fans kind of like having a couple defenders that are a little like that, just a little like there's something like this kid's a little different. You know what I mean? Like he's a little wild.
Kind about him too.
Yeah, like if I'm at a bar, if I'm out at a club and some stuff goes down, I'd rather have Jordan Botelho on my side. You get what I'm saying?
1,000%.
So he's got a little bit of that to him, but then also he's shown these flashes of being a really impactful player. And so the question with him is he is the biggest enigma of anybody on the defensive line to me, because there's this assumption with him that he's going to come out and just be really good this year for Notre Dame. And because of how he finished the season last year, had that great performance against obviously South Carolina, was good against the run, was very disruptive against the pass. He did some really good things last year. Brady had 8, according to Pro Football Focus, he had 18 pressures on 77 pass rush snaps. That's absurd. Like that.
Yeah, that's like 22% or something.
Yeah, I mean that's getting you into like Will Anderson numbers from 2021. That's what that is. I mean, that's an absurd number of pressures.
But can he do that when his snap count goes
right? And he had 7 total hits on the quarterback in 77 snaps. Again, that's an absurd number. But as you were saying, Brian, can he do it regularly? Can he do it consistently? And can he do it when it matters? Because I've said this, Brian, and I've never said this to you, so I'm curious as your thoughts. Isaiah Foskey was more productive from a sheer number standpoint in 2022. 14 tackles for loss, 11 sacks is better than what he did in 2000 and the year before. And the year before, and he had 12 and a half tackles for loss and 11 sacks. So he's more productive, but he was a far better player in 2021 because he made clutch plays. You think of the strip sack against Cincinnati that Drew White picks up the ball, Cincinnati's about to blow Notre Dame out. It's 17-0. They're driving. Foskey makes a strip sack. Drew White picks it up, runs it back a long way. They scored 17-7 ball game. You think of the strip sack against Oklahoma State that gave the offense the ball with a chance to kind of go down there and make it a game. You think of, early USC's driving. He has two huge pressures to force a field goal attempt. He was clutch. He was money. They didn't have that last year. That's my biggest concern with Jordan Botelho is when you go watch him play last year, it's just there were times you're like, what is he doing? And then there's times you're like, wow, that guy's got a chance to be really good. What are we going to see more of this year? Are we going to see more of that consistent guy? Because if we do, there is no doubt in my mind he can be an 8+ sack per game guy for Notre Dame this year, a 10+ tackle for loss guy for Notre Dame this year, because I actually think he's got a lot of disruptive ability in the run game because there's some things you can do with him you couldn't do with Foskey. Foskey was basically a big end playing Viper. He was 6'5", long arms, 265. He's long arming you. He's basically setting the edge. Botelho's a guy that you can actually shoot inside and penetrate inside. You can play more line games as a defensive coordinator with him, where you can slant Riley Mills outside, bring Jordan Botelho on loops, things that you're not going to really do with Isaiah Foskey. So he actually gives you some things. You can drop him off into coverage a little bit more. You can stack him in a 3-3, and you can have Mills on the outside, or you can even put Riley in the nose in certain situations and have Cross and the other guys on the outside. There's just different things you can do, but you can move him around. You can do things with him, but you can only do that if you can count on him, because you're not going to build a game plan around a guy that you can't count on. And that's the big thing. If they can count on Jordan Botelho this year, Brian, he's got a chance to be really good. And then, and this is what I want you to comment on all of this. I'm going to wrap it up, and I want to just let you go. If again, these are a lot of ifs, but if Riley Mills can be a consistent player of what we've seen, if Jordan Botelho can be consistently the player that we've seen, now all of a sudden you're talking about this defensive line have a chance to be really, really good.
If what you just said right there comes to fruition, there's no reason that the numbers 4 and 0 shouldn't be put together. And that relates to sacks. They were pretty close to it last year. But I don't need 3 guys to have 10. I'd rather have 8 guys have 5.
Right.
You know what I mean? Just
and then like one guy's got 8, one guy's got like 7.5, 9. Yes, exactly.
I'm curious. You mentioned the stack, and these defenses change every year because offenses in the spread have so much of an advantage. Coming out in 22 personnel play power, they go no huddle, then they come out in the next play and they're in full on spread, and you got 3 linebackers in the game, and you get murdered. That's why the stack was invented. Like, we got to find a way to get more speedy guys on the field. So here's the question. You talked about Botelho moving back and playing some linebacker. Flat out, I'm not convinced he's going to take the playbook serious enough based on his mentality to do all the little things with the checks and the gaps. That's my concern.
Right.
He's hell on wheels when he just dips the shoulder. I mean, he's a freak athlete. And you could tell the kid likes the weight room. All those are good.
Yes.
Can he cover somebody and do it properly on 3rd and 6? That's got to be a checkbox.
Right. It's just that I need to trust you snap after snap after snap. 100%. And if he can be that guy, he can be disruptive. And Brian, here's a point of what you're talking about. Last year, Notre Dame, last season, looking at the statistics last season, pulling those back up, Notre Dame ranked 13th in the country last year in sacks, which is pretty good. They had
I mean, they were good at it.
Yeah. Right. But here's the thing. Yet Isaiah Foskey had 11 of those. The next highest guy was Botelho with 4.5. Let's look at a couple other teams. Louisville last year had 50 sacks. Not a single guy on their roster had more than 9.5. Nobody had double digits. You had 4 guys that were higher than Notre Dame's number 2. 9.5, 9, 6 and 6, 4.5, 3, 3, 2.5. So 50 sacks, nobody double figures. Pitt last year had 48 sacks. That's 10 more than Notre Dame. Nobody had more than 7. Clemson last year had 44 sacks. Now they played one more game than Notre Dame, right? So Notre Dame actually averaged slightly under Clemson in sacks per game. Clemson was a 3.1, Notre Dame was a 2.9. But when you look at Clemson last year, nobody had more than 6.5. And so that's what you're referring to. Now, it's nice to have – now, if you're going to have a guy that has 12 and 13, that's cool, but then you're 50-plus sacks is basically where you need to be. And that's your point is you need to be in the 40s, but it needs to be a more disruptive. And here's why that matters, in my opinion, and I want to know if this is where you're coming from too, Brian. If I have one great sack guy, then – you as a defense or an offense, if you're really good, Georgia can do this, Bama can do this, Ohio State can do this. You can say, hey, our scheme, We can take him out of the game. We can neutralize him. You remember when Michigan did this to Chase Young in 2019? Yeah, like 4 sacks against Penn State, or 3 sacks against Penn State, 4 sacks against Wisconsin, 0 tackles for loss against Michigan. Because Michigan basically said, we're not going to let you beat us. And you can stop. You can do that. Teams did that to Notre Dame last year. They basically said, as long as we block Isaiah Foskey on 3rd down, they're not going to get to us. And if they do, they're going to be undisciplined in their pass rush. And like last year, I can't tell you how many times Jason Adamiola, as a 3 technique, ran past the quarterback and just let the quarterback step into the pocket and go make plays, right? So if you can stop him, when you're a team that has, like again, like I talked to Louisville, or excuse me, Pitt last year, Pitt had 48 sacks. Brian, there's only 6 guys that had more than 3. But the point is they had a bunch of guys that could get after the quarterback based on their scheme. You look at Louisville last year, 4 guys with 6 or more, nobody in double figures, 5 guys with 4.5 or more, nobody in double figures. Say, hey, if you're going to spend all your time stopping Jordan Botelho, sliding your protection of Jordan Botelho, then you're vulnerable to this, and this. And if Notre Dame can be really good on that side and say, now Riley Mills, and because what I mean by that is the way that Notre Dame does their alignment primarily, the 3 technique and the Viper are on the same side of the field. So they play like a lot of underfronts. Underfront basically means your nose is to the field, your 3 techniques to the boundary, your Vipers to the boundary. Then, of course, you have your field end to the field, about the most self-explanatory position in football. And so you have those 2 guys to the same side. If they're both really disruptive, what that forces teams to do, Brian, is to put their protection, to slide their protection, to emphasize their protection to the boundary. If you can beat this, it's very difficult. Whereas if it's just Botelho, you can just chip him. You can put a tight end or a back and just chip him. If it's Botelho and Mills, or if it's just Mills, you can center guard him and do some different things that way. But if it's Mills and Botelho, you now have to set your entire protection philosophy to the boundary. Now all of a sudden you've got Javonte Jean-Baptiste, and my pressure package is all coming from the field. Now that's how I can overload you with numbers without having to overload you. Excuse me. That's how I can overload you with numbers to a side without having to overload you on numbers as far as number of total blitzers. And that's where you can be disruptive. And that's why it's imperative that these 2 kids, above all others, really step up. To me, we're going to talk about Rubio and Onye and Javonte Jean-Baptiste and Junior Tuihalamaka and Josh Burnham and Tyson Bourne, these guys. But to me, Jordan Botelho and Riley Mills both stepping up. They're both seniors now. Those 2 guys stepping up is the difference between Notre Dame being good on the defensive line this year or championship caliber on the defensive line this year. And it has to be, to me, both of them. I would say Mills 1 and Botelho 2 in importance, because I think that with Josh Burnham and Junior Tuihalamaka and some other guys, you could even put Javonte Jean-Baptiste over there if you're struggling over there. I mean, there's things you could do where you could put Nana and some other guys at the field end. But to me, nobody has the potential up the middle for this season to do what Riley Mills can do. Maybe down the road, Tyson Ford can be that guy. Maybe down the road, Gabriel Rubio can be that guy, or Jason Onye can be that guy. But for 2023, they need Riley Mills to step up. They need Jordan Botelho to step up. They do that, and we're going to have some fun covering this football team this year, Brian.
I also think statistically, and I'm fascinated with Baptiste. He was pretty highly recruited, et cetera, et cetera. If I remember right, he's a DMV guy or something from that area, isn't he? Maryland?
Maryland, yeah. Yeah, I believe so. No, he was a Bergen Catholic kid from Jersey.
Oh, Jersey kid. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, he's East Coaster. If you're single covering him every play, and he kind of knows that he's assuming he's not, when you get chipped as a D end, you're in trouble. But assuming he's just going one-on-one every play and he's not going against a left tackle, he could have 6 or 7 sacks this year. Would not surprise. Part of that could just be effort plays. You know how the commentator will say, well, that was a coverage sack. Well, that's okay, because Notre Dame's secondary has a chance to be really good. Number 20 in particular is probably going to be lonely a lot this year, because I don't think, like the Clemson game, I don't know what they were thinking. I was watching that again last
Well, you know what they were thinking? I don't want to throw to number 5.
Well, yeah, 5's good too, and they just picked the freshman, but it did not work out well. I'd throw a 5.
The funny thing is they threw at 5 early, and he blew them up. I mean, they kept trying to throw screens, and he was blowing them up. And so they're like, let's try this number 20 kid. But to your point, Brian, that's the potential.
Absolutely.
And you made this point on our show, I think like 2 years ago. you looked at all the teams that had like won playoff games, and you had something like every team that's like won playoff games had like a first or second round draft pick, a corner, something like that, right? I
The
mean, that was the point that you had
2016
made.
playoff,
Right.
every team the next spring, even all four of them, Washington, Ohio State, Clemson, Bam, all four of them had a first or second round pick at corner. Certain spots.
And it continued throughout the next several years. I mean, as far as the teams that are out there winning, Clemson had two guys like that in 2018.
Yeah. Notre Dame is finally to that point. So
Bingo.
the D-line should absolutely, unequivocally benefit.
Bingo.
Thank God. I've waited my entire life for this moment. Thank you. It's been a minute.
It's been a minute. It's been since the early 90s since we've been able to look at this football team and be this way. And I think that's an important piece, Brian, because what they do schematically, and again, this is not a knock on Clark Lee. What Clark Lee did worked. And I think very highly of Clark Lee. It's just, it was different. You had zone corners. You had guys in 2018, and Troy Pride could play man, but Julian Love was a zone guy. He was an off-ball zone guy, off the ball lineup, keep everything in front of you kind of guy. That's going to factor into some of your disruptives numbers. That's why, because you're a read and react, play your gap, play your assignment type of guy, and then we'll turn you loose on third down. This defense is going to be much more aggressive from snap one to the end of the game. I mean, hey, we're trying to make disruptives on play one. And I think that's something that Al Golden's trying to do this year, is he's trying to get more early down disruptives. And here's the thing. If you have to blitz to get early down disruptives, you're going to struggle against the better teams in your schedule. You're going to overwhelm the inferior teams on your schedule. But if you're having to blitz on first down against Ohio State and USC in order to create disruptives, they're going to get you. That doesn't mean you can't blitz on first down. You just mean it's like we always say, blitz. And Ryan talked about this last week in our mailbag as well. You want to blitz because you want to. I've said this as well. You want to blitz because you want to, not because you have to. And that's where the defensive line comes into play. Javonte Jean-Baptiste, to me, is going to be a big part of this, because I have full confidence that he's going to be a disruptive pass rusher. Full confidence. And that's what he was used as Ohio State. Where my question for him is, I need to see him be better. Not better. I need to see what he can do against the run, because they're going to use that position differently this year, Ryan. I don't think it's going to be that set the edge, physical, wrong arm the guy, stay there, funnel everything back inside. There's going to be something to that, especially with Nana's in the game. But I think there's going to be a level of disruption this year too, where you're going to see more slant the big end inside and bring that Mike on the outside, or bring a rover off the edge, and some different things like that for your run stunt game. And so I think we're going to see a more aggressive first down defense this year, not so much from a blitzing standpoint, because I don't view a 4 defensive linemen and a backer a blitz. That's a stunt. A blitz to me is more than 5. Or you overload a side. That's a blitz to me. With 5, you overload a side. I don't think 5 is a blitz for me. I don't count it as a blitz. I count it as a run stunt. And so I think they're going to do a lot more of that stuff. And I think you have an end, or I believe you have an end this year in Javonte Jean-Baptiste, who brings the length and athleticism, because as Riley Mills is very athletic for a 290-plus pound kid. Javonte Jean-Baptiste is just athletic. I mean, it's not for his size. He's just quick. Now, he was a good niche player at Ohio State, good rotation player at Ohio State. Can he be a every down guy at Notre Dame? Can he be a guy that can come out and be disruptive on a consistent basis? That's a question mark. But I think the athleticism is there, and that's the biggest thing I look at when I look at this defensive line, Brian. You put Mills in a 3 technique, Cross at at nose. You put Botelho at the boundary, or Viper, and now you've got Javonte Jean-Baptiste as your field end. I don't know if this line is going to be very good. I don't know if it's going to be better than past years, but one thing I can guarantee you, it's going to be one of the most athletic starting defensive lines in college football next year. There's no doubt about that.
It's going to be as athletic as what Clemson puts on the field on a yearly basis. That's probably the best for a 4-man line, kind of how I would define it. And Notre Dame usually has pretty athletic D-lines, but there's one guy that's more of a plugger, kind of like a certain nose guard who is no longer there, but his brother is. He wasn't a pass rusher.
No.
Man, he was going to play his butt off, and he would plug the run. 3rd and 1, he was not fun to run at, that kind of guy.
He would be that guy that would get that 1st and 10 TFL in 2018 and 2019, yes.
But at the same time, if you're going to win a national title, you need a nose guard that can take over a game, at least for short stints.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't that guy. I didn't think, especially 3rd and 6. The teams that go to the title game, take TCU out. They're the complete anomaly for the playoffs so far. They're the only team that didn't have a defensive guy that's made it to the title game that you're like, man, that guy's unbelievable, blah, blah, blah. I don't think they had a guy like that, really.
And Brian, TCU gave up 45 and 65 points in the 2 playoff games, right? I mean, so they weren't winning because of their defense.
Yeah.
But that's
Sonny
your point,
coach
though, Brian.
Offense.
Right. They went to the playoff and gave up 45 and 65 points because they didn't have that.
Yeah.
That's going to be the question.
If you meshed, and I'm not trying to pick on them, Georgia's D-line and their D-line, how many guys from TCU would have even made the 3rd team?
1.
2?
1.
Maybe. Like 2 was
they had one. I think it was
their
they had one end who was a good player. He'd have been in their rotation. Sure. Yeah.
But I mean, Georgia, literally, they had 3rd team guys that were freshmen that could have picked other schools and started.
Yeah. Right.
That's just the difference. At the end of the year, that's when recruiting really shows up because teams are, this was especially true when Notre Dame was bad towards Charlie's end. Notre Dame didn't have the depth. At the end of the year, how bad they were on defense. They couldn't stop me. So
that's the word right there, Brian. That's the word right there. Depth. That's the next part of this conversation. You're only as good as your depth, in my opinion, on the defensive
100%.
line. Now, you're going to have depth. Everyone has depth. It's called a body. The question is, what's the quality of the depth? And that's where I kind of get a little excited about what this team could be. Because there's guys coming off the bench that have the potential, and this is now where Al Washington is going to really make his money. It's this area right here. When you have guys like Gabriel Rubio, Jason Onye, Junior Tuihalamaka, Josh Burnham, Tyson Ford, Aiden Gobira, there's a lot of really talented athletes in that group. How many of those guys can you get ready to play this year? For example, if Josh Burnham was at Georgia, the way that they've developed defensive line, there's no question he has a sophomore breakout. None. You get that first year moving from linebacker to learn and develop, and then the next year he goes back out and boom, he's a factor, whether it's a starter or a rotation guy.
Sure.
So is Al Washington going to do the same thing? Because one of my questions with Al Washington was, based on last year, was, does he coach the entire depth chart? And I've heard enough things that make that a concern for me in year 1. Now, does he improve on that in year 2? We're going to find out. Where you can't just let Josh Burnham and Tyson Ford be ignored for an entire season. You got to coach those guys up. Mike Elson was great at that. Mike Mickens is great at that. Like, that's what the best coaches do. And Chancey Stuckey was really good at that last year too, but that's a little bit different because he only had like 6 scholarship receivers by the end of it. It's a little easier in that
We're going to be joking about that for the rest of our lives.
But there's so much talent, and we're not even getting into the freshman class. There's so much talent there that you need at least 3 of those guys to really be productive rotation players. You can afford to have one guy coming off the bench and just, give me 10, 12 snaps and be a solid guy. One of the underrated parts of last year's defensive line to me, Brian, was there were times when the second team interior defensive line would come on the field and actually outplay the starters. With Chris Smith, with Howard Cross. Yeah. Jacob Lacey came off the bench against Cal before he transferred. And so if you can continue that this year, now part of that was because the starters didn't play well. That was part of it, right? But when you've got Rubio, I really think he's going to make a nice jump in year 3. I expect that. Jason Onye, if he can build on his big spring, those are going to be important parts. Because if I'm bringing in, and this is something that's a lot different last year. Obviously, Howard Cross is a smaller kid. But last year, Notre Dame didn't have great size, period. Now you look at their team, and you're talking about bringing in 290-plus pound Jason Onye off the bench. You're bringing in 300-pound Gabriel Rubio off the bench. And now all of a sudden, I'm dealing with a little bit of a different body type than I was before. So that's something that you look at, too, and say, hey, there aren't a lot of attacking 4-3, 4-2-5 teams that can bring an athletic 302-pound kid like Rubio off the bench and an athletic 292, 295-pound kid like Jason Onye off the bench. So those guys need to step up and play well too. But to me, the big key is after them, you've got 2 sophomores at Viper and Junior Tuihalamaka and Josh Burnham that have a lot of talent. Junior, run player first, pass rusher second. Josh Burnham right now, to me, has as much pass rushing potential as anybody on the roster. If Al Washington doesn't make him a pet project this offseason and in fall camp, then he's just not doing his coaching thing right. He's just not. Because that kid could be really key. You just bring him in off the bench and let him play 15, 20 snaps a game, and you get, hey, Josh, you got one job. See that guy receiving the snap? Get him. That's your job. That's your job. That's it.
Well, my excitement for the D-line, and maybe it's just because I know him and I'm biased, but Tyson Ford, athletically and size and the long levers, most years, even though he wasn't ready last year, would have played at Notre Dame over the last 25 years. I mean, he barely, I don't know how many games he played in. I'm sure it was a few, but now they can actually develop him in a normal way where he's not overwhelmed and getting his butt beat by some fifth-year senior from, a Power 5 school that knows what he's doing at offensive tackle. And he's only going to have to play so many snaps. That does a couple of things. Number one, gives him confidence. Hey, I'm getting better. I'm getting some snaps. But B, I know I'm not going to get 35, 40 reps. So on these 15 or 20 or whatever he gets, he can go full go with his athleticism. I was listening to a Georgia podcast recently, and one of their guys that started only had like 320 reps or something like that last year. Mm-hmm. And they went to the title game.
Yeah, I've talked about that, Brian. I've actually pulled that set up. They did not have a lot of defensive linemen.
It might have been you that talked about it too that I saw. But Notre Dame, let's just be 99%.
I'll give you the stat, Brian. The defensive lineman that had the most snaps on their entire team last year was Robert Beal Jr., who's was like a sixth-year senior last year.
Yep.
And he had 486. That's it. Then you had Nazir Stackhouse, 473, Michael Williams, 410. Those are the only three defensive linemen that played more than 400 snaps last year in 15 games for Georgia. 15 games. And then you had Jalen Carter was 392, Trent Walther was 283, Warren Brinson was 272. You didn't have
bigger guys, especially were under 300. When has Notre Dame been able to do
Bear Alexander was 169 last year. He was only 169.
Think about how talented he was. He averaged 10 reps a game.
Yeah.
I mean, no other school in the country is doing that.
Notre Dame's leader in snaps last year was Isaiah Foskey with 563.
That's a lot.
So he had 80 more snaps than Robert Beal in three less games because he didn't play in the bowl game. He only played in 12 games last year for Notre Dame. Jason Adamiola last year only played in 12 games last year. Or Justin Adamiola played in 13. Justin Adamiola was number 2 on their team in snaps. He had 485. Howard Cross had 477. So your number 3 defensive lineman, Howard Cross, in snaps last year, had 9 fewer snaps than the guy for Georgia who led their defensive line in snaps. And he did that. He needed 2 more games to do that because he did it in 15 games. Howard Cross did it in 13. Notre Dame last year, Brian, had, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 defensive linemen last year in 13 games had over 400 snaps. Georgia last year had 3 in 15 games. That's it. And then the other thing you look at,
winning and losing.
2 of Georgia's guys that did that were edges. They only had 1 interior guy that had over 400 snaps. That was Nazir Stackhouse at 473. Notre Dame had obviously had 2 and 3 if you want to count Riley Mills late in the year, ended up moving to 3 technique in the last few games. So the rotation is key. You relied way too much on your starters last year. Part of it is because your defense was on the field too much. Like, make some stops, get off the freaking field. You know what I mean? But you need to be able to have, because as a coach, you can say all you want, Brian, hey, we're going to get this guy in the game, get that guy in the game. But at the end of the day, when you're playing the best teams in your schedule, if you don't trust those second-tier guys to go in there and make plays, you're going to struggle. Part of the reason Notre Dame's starters had to play so much in 2012 and why the defense wore down a little bit late in the year is because there was a big drop-off between Lewis Nix and Tony Springman and between Capron Lewis Moore and true freshman Sheldon Day and whoever was coming off the bench to replace Stephon Tuitt. There's a big drop-off. I mean, you're putting like Chase Hounsell in the game and Tony Springman. You couldn't afford to take those guys off the field in big games. This year, the talent is too good for you have to rely on your starters for 45 to 50 snaps a game. It's just too good. If you're doing that, most likely you're not doing a good enough job developing those kids and getting them ready to play. To me, that's how and again, this isn't a thing where, you know what drove me nuts last year too? This is something they need to change. They would go into games and they would literally have the entire second team defensive line in the game. One thing I loved about what Clark Lee did is he would have his starters, and then after that, basically Jerry Tillery hardly ever played again with Jonathan Bonner. He would play with Kurt Heinisch. And then John Bonner would be on the field with Myron Tungavaloa-Mosa. So basically, on the inside, you always had a starter with a number 2 almost the entire game, because you were never going to put both of your backups on the field at the same time, or you would rarely do that. And I think there needs to be a smarter rotation strategy too. That's something that gets overlooked a lot, Brian. You can't just have a full wave of 4 backups on the field unless they're just flat out dudes. I mean, Georgia doesn't even do that very often. And they have the talent to get away with something like that, right? So I think that's another part, is being smarter with how you use it. But at the end of the day, Brian, if you do your job as a coach, I'm actually not going to be as upset if you line up on a snap and you've got Gabriel Rubio, Jason Onye, Nana Osafa-Mensah, and Josh Burnham or Junior Talamaka on the field together. I'd say, you know what? That's pretty good. That might be your starting defensive line next year if these guys all go pro, you know? And so that's the thing but it's all about development, Brian, because Josh Burnham's got a chance to someday be a stud at Notre Dame. Junior Talamaka has a chance to be a very good player at Notre Dame someday. Gabriel Rubio, Jason Onye, Donovan Heinisch, Tyson Ford. That I just, off the top of my head, named 6 guys. I didn't even talk about Nana, right? I mean, I didn't talk about Aiden Gobira. We haven't even talked about the freshmen. There's way too much God-given ability in this group and size and length in this group for it not to be a deep, effective group. And if they're not, I've got to be able to look at the guy at the top of the board and say, you're not getting the job done. But if they do play well, then you've got to look at Al Washington and say, hey, we got to get this recruiting stuff figured out. But you know what, man? You coached the mess out of this defensive line this year. That's why another reason why this is just a huge year for Al Washington. I can work with you on getting the recruiting going if you're getting the kids that we're getting coached up. I can work with that, and that's going to be big for him. On top of it being big for the entire defense.
Well, if you do well on the field, I have no idea what Ohio State's quarterback situation is going to shake out to be, but it's not going to be CJ. That I do know. Notre Dame goes out and gets 4 sacks against Ohio State and wins 31-27 in a great game. Do you think that they could make a phone call to some kid that's committed to Georgia or Florida or wherever and try and flip them?
Right.
It's a hell of a lot easier after you beat Ohio State and you've earned it. Look, I live down here in Florida where kids, the only thing they talk about is going to the NFL.
Right.
The degree thing is a bonus. That's nice. But most of the kids down here in particular, they don't even know what state Notre Dame's in anyway. But if you're going to get elite D linemen consistently, over half the battle is, what have you done to put guys in the NFL?
Right. And produce.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the thing. And produce.
You know, I mean, I'm really rooting for a certain guy that's now a part of the Saints.
Yes.
It's important for Notre Dame.
You got to do one of 2 things, ideally 2 things. Ideally, you're producing and you're putting guys in the NFL. Like, if you actually look at Georgia's defensive linemen, they don't produce like in college. Like, their numbers aren't great. Jordan Davis 2 years ago had 6 tackles for loss and 3 sacks. But you know what the number that the kids care about is 12. Well, what 12 or 13, right? That's where he got drafted, right?
He took a double team on every play.
Yeah.
NFL teams love that.
Right. Jalen Carter last year, you're talking about, Riley Mills. Jalen Carter's numbers last year were basically identical to Riley Mills's numbers were. What Riley Mills' numbers were last year. I mean, Riley Mills had 6 tackles for loss and 3.5 sacks in 13 games. Jalen Carter and Riley had 24 tackles. Jalen Carter had 32 tackles. And he had 7 tackles for loss and 3 sacks. So Riley Mills actually had more sacks than Jalen Carter did last year. But you know what they care about? Was it number 5, number 6, right? 9?
Jalen might have went number 2 or 3 if it wasn't.
Yeah. So you've got to do one of 2 things. You've got to produce at a high level where kids can say, hey, look, yeah, this guy didn't get picked high because he's not an NFL talent. You are. What could we do with you in this defense? You've got to have that at some point in time. That's how you convince the elite talents to come, and then you can develop the NFL players. but it's going to be key. And the thing that could be really big for Notre Dame is if they are able to throw waves at people. That's going to be huge because now you can say, hey, look, I know we got 4 starters coming back last year, but did you see last year we had 9 kids that played over 200 snaps last year. We had over 9 kids that had at least 4 tackles, or 6 or 7, 8 kids that had at least 4 tackles for loss last year. That kind of thing. That's going to be key, and it's going to be a lot on that. And here's the thing too, Brian. What speaks to the depth, we haven't even talked about Boubacar Traore and Brennan Vernon and Armel Mukam and Devin Houston.
Some of those guys are going to try and push their way
Notre
in.
Dame, Brian, Notre Dame has had playoff teams where these kids would come in and be immediate 2 deep guys. Immediately 2 deep guys.
Now they're going to be 4th team, give or take.
Right. I do have a bold prediction. Here's my bold prediction.
Here we go.
One of those guys this year, one of those freshmen, I don't know who it's going to be, Boubacar, Armel, Vernon, not sure which guy, Devin Houston, not sure which guy. One of those guys is going to force his way onto the field this year.
That's usually what happens. But you don't
happen. And I think it's going to be at the big end position. That's where I think it's going to happen because that's the one position I look at and say, Nana does some nice things as a rotation guy, but you want Nana to be like at 15 snaps a game. That's where you want Nana to be. Well, you can't then have Baptiste playing 45, 50 snaps a game.
Nah, he'd be dead by the time we got.
You need to get that third guy. So between Vernon, Traore, Boubacar, and Armel Mukam, that's kind of where I'm leaning right now because Devin Houston could be really good this year and still have a hard time getting on the field when you look at what's in front of them. One of those big ends to me, Brennan Vernon, Boubacar Traore, or Armel Mukam is going to come in this year and force their way into the field and be a key part of the rotation. That's a prediction I'm going to have this year. And when that happens, all of a sudden your talent level goes up. And that's going to be a big part of it because there is a lot of ability. So let's kind of start to come to a close here, Brian, as we wrap this part up. Let's talk about the 3 things that right now you view as the biggest strengths of this defensive line heading into the season. Not so much it doesn't have to be so much of what we know, but what you confidently say going into the season, this is what I expect to be a strength of this defensive line. Either it could be something big picture or it could be specifically about a player. So what would be your 3 things, Brian, when you look at this Notre Dame defensive line that you're most confident in heading into the 2023 season?
Number 1 is something that it's kind of ironic, but it's just true. All the guys that are projected to start, this is their final go-round probably. I believe a certain defensive tackle now has another year of eligibility because of the 220 season. But
they actually all have it. They all have it because of COVID. The only guy that doesn't have a year left is Javonte Jean-Baptiste. I'm not saying they're all going to take it, but they at least have that COVID year, which is a little bit weird and wonky, but yes.
Yeah. I think because they would all like to leave, nothing against Notre Dame, but
sure.
You got to put the pedal to the metal, man.
Yeah.
There's nothing like emotion and motivation, especially when you're playing Ohio State, Southern Cal, Clemson, NC State to a certain degree too. I mean, you play that
because it's a road game.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be on national TV here. Let's go out and make this happen. Trying to impress scout. That's one thing for sure that I'm really looking at. If they don't come out, because you brought this up, and it's 100%. There were games in moments like Clemson. The D line played pretty good most of the game, but I think Clemson's O line is not anywhere near what some of their other positions.
And it was young. It was also young. They had a true freshman starter.
Beat them up, especially in the middle last year, because they're running. I mean, look, Will Shipley's a dude. There were times where he just had zero room to go. Notre Dame just ate him up. But they didn't do that consistently against Southern Cal, obviously. Part of that's the snap thing we were just talking about. So I need to see the motivation and the depth. The other thing that I really want to see is what you just mentioned about the younger guys. My pick is Tyson Ford to eventually be basically a co-number two, for lack of a better term. I think him and Anya and those guys are all interchangeable, and I'm hoping that Ford can be a part of the speed package. Like if they go 3-man line, he could be your nose. That on 3rd and 11, if you run the ball and get 7 yards, I don't care. That he just one gaps, goes up the field and makes the center miserable, that kind of thing. One of those guys has to do it. And if they have that, they can, again, my number is 40. That's the bottom end number that I want to see on sacks.
Yeah.
And then finally, I know it's your guy, but a certain Mr. Burnham, he needs to take a step forward. Yeah. I'm not saying he's getting 12 sacks this year.
No. If he just gives me
6. Something
Brian,
like
if he just looks like what Isaiah Foskey did in 2020, 4.5 sacks, be a good rotation player, show promise.
Yes.
Because that was the thing is when we saw this at Notre Dame when they were really rolling in the late 2010s. When you lost Julian Aguirre, you're like, it's fine. They got Dalen Hayes. You lost Khalid Kareem. Oh, great player. We're fine. They got Adekuba Ogundiji. You lose Dalen Hayes. You're like, they're fine. They've got Isaiah Foskey. But it stopped at the big end position at that point in time. It stopped where you had that next in line guy, right? And so to me, it's he's got to be that guy that if he comes out this year and if Botelho does go pro after this year, which I would say if Riley Mills and Josh Byrne and Jordan Botelho go pro after this year for the right reasons,
it's a good year.
That what we talked about at the beginning it came true. They were both very, 100%. Very good. Then you're like, they're fine because, but with Burnham and Tuihalamaka next year, they're going to be great there. They're going to be fine, And we're talking about, a great 1-2 punch where he doesn't have to have 9 sacks. Foskey only had 4.5 sacks that year, but you just knew, you saw, and you're like, well, he's going to be fine because, he got his feet wet. He went out there, did what he needed to do. He was a redshirt freshman basically that year in 2020, and you said he's going to be good in 2021, and he was going into year 3. So to your point, yes, Josh Burnham needs to be that guy, and the thing about him though, Brian, is because he didn't play defensive end. That's why it's so important that Al Golden or Al Washington and Coach Derico, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, and whoever else is working with the D-line, whether it's Nick Sebastian, whoever else, they need to take that kid under their wing because he doesn't have the background playing that position. You need to teach him how to play that position because here's the thing. God gave him all the tools he needs to be great. Work ethic, length, athleticism, all of that. He already has that. You just got to teach him how to play the game. And if you don't, that's on you. Because it's not like he's not coachable and he doesn't want it. He wants it. It's just whether or not you're going to put the work in to make him good. So mine are, Brian, I really feel good. I feel better than I should about the defensive tackle rotation this year. I do. I think
it'll be good.
I think will it be great? That I don't know, but I think it's going to be pretty good. And honestly, because the one guy that they lost last year to me underwhelmed. I mean, the one guy you lost in the rotation underwhelmed last year. You're basically replacing him with Riley Mills. Everybody else, I mean, the biggest loss they had from the interior last year is Chris Smith. I mean, that's their biggest miss from last year. I think Jason Onye can handle that. I think Gabriel Rubio can take some of that. I think with Donovan Heinisch a year older, with Riley Mills, boy, I feel good about the interior. Now, is it going to be great? That remains to be seen, but it's at least going to be good. The other strength I have, I really think the Viper position is going to be really good this year. Botelho doesn't have to be a 50. He doesn't have to be Foskey. I could see a scenario this year, Brian, where Notre Dame gets more production from the Viper position than it did last year, although nobody comes close to having the numbers individually that Isaiah Foskey had. I could see that. I mean, because you basically had, let's see, I'm talking about the guys that kind of primarily played that. You had 20.5 with those two, 23, 24, and then you had 24.5. You had 24.5 tackles for loss last year at the Viper position. If you count Justin Adamiola, that number's a bit padded because some of his production came as like a rotation kind of guy. And then you had, 15.5, 18.5 sacks. I could easily see the Viper position this year as a unit outproducing that. I could, especially the tackles for loss numbers. And nobody has more than 9 because you're going to have 3 guys doing it. You know what I mean? So you're going to, especially from a sack standpoint. So I'm very confident there as long as there's good health and good coaching. The talent is certainly there. The third one, Ryan, is I do feel that they have the depth to survive the season. Now, how good is it going to be? That's a question. There's not a position where you look at and say, boy, if that guy goes down, they're screwed. I mean, if Riley Mills goes down, God forbid, I don't want it to happen, but you're putting in Gabriel Rubio. You're not exactly putting in a guy that can't play, and so you don't want it to happen, but they can survive if there's a loss on the defensive line this year. Now, Brian, let's look at the biggest concerns. What are the biggest question marks we have? I think the first one for me is you got to prove it. I think the pass rush potential for this team is greater than it was last year. And this is no disrespect to Justin Adamiola because he was a very high motor kid. But the fact of the matter is the kids replacing him in the depth chart this year are far superior athletically, far superior. The question is, Brian, and I use this phrase a lot, are we going to be talking about potential of this unit or production by the time we get to Ohio State? That's the question mark. So I'm confident in the talent, but the question is, can they produce? And also, can they produce in the big moments? Because I don't care what your talent level is, being money isn't about being talented. Being money is about having something here and something here that other people don't have. John Elway wasn't the most clutch quarterback that I've ever seen in my life. And Joe Montana wasn't a great clutch quarterback because of their physical gifts. They were clutch because they also had this and this. That's kind of what I'm referring to. That I don't know. And to me, that's my biggest question mark with this defensive line is that right there.
Well, I'm hoping that the one concern that I have with Cross doesn't happen in an individual game and it costs him. He's still 270-ish, whatever his weight is. If a team, like remember last year against Clemson, Notre Dame ran duo about 50 freaking times. It was ungodly boring, but they averaged 5 yards a carry doing it, so whatever. Can Notre Dame hold up against a team that gets in a niche? Like Ohio State's got, I love their running back. The one, not Travion, the other kid. He just runs.
And Williams. Well, that's what they did to Notre Dame in the fourth quarter, Brian. They said, we've got a lead now. We're just going to run the ball, and there's not a dang thing you can do about it.
Notre Dame's nose guard play is lacking size. That's my concern. So that's the other reason that I want Ford and all those other guys to rotate in. That's a lot of size. Like Ford's somewhat big at 290. Mm-hmm. I mean, Notre Dame is massive up front on their D-line now.
Compared to what they've been, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, Notre Dame, even in the early 90s, didn't have this much depth.
No.
They didn't.
And Brian, you say, well, size. Well, look at Georgia. It's a completely different defense.
Yeah, Georgia Notre Dame isn't 300-pounders because they're playing a true three.
Right. It's size relative to the style of play that you have. You don't see teams that play the attacking style that are throwing everybody they're throwing out now up the middle is 290 plus. Last year they had two guys in their rotation above 290. That's it.
Right.
This year you're probably going to have one guy that's under 290, and that's Howard Cross. Everybody else is going to be over 290. Jason Adamiola is 10 pounds lighter than Riley Mills was and probably going to be closer to 15. I mean, Chris Smith was really the only true big guy you had. Now Gabriel Rubio's over 300 pounds. Jason Onye's over 290 pounds. Aiden Kana'an is 320 pounds. Like, you're throwing some big boys in there now. And I think that's important. The other question mark that I have too, Brian, comes down to Al Washington. We're willing to give him a mulligan last year, but he still has to prove himself this season. He does. He has to prove himself. And so he does enter the season as a question mark. We're going to learn a lot about Coach Washington in 2023, because as we've said this entire show, he is not working with a group of inferior players that he just has to figure out a way to get the most out of them. And that's the thing about Mike Elson in 2018. Mike Elson did not take a bunch of average athletes and turn them into a great D-line. He took dudes and turned them into dudes. I mean, that's what Jerry Tillery and Dalen Hayes and Julian Aguilar and Adetokunbo Ogundeji, those are all NFL players. Right? Notre Dame's third-string Viper in 2018 has started games in the NFL. Third-string guy, Jameer Jones. Right? There's NFL talent on this defensive line. Now, is there any Jalen Carters? And no, I don't think there's that. I don't think that's there, at least not in the non-freshman class. But there's a bunch of NFL players like the 2018 D-line, because who was the first-round pick on that D-line? Jerry Tillery was a first-round pick. I didn't even think he was their best player. I thought he was overdrafted, to be completely honest with you. They had a bunch of day 2 and day 3 guys, and that worked for them. And I think that's the approach this team needs to have. The question is, do they have a coach that can get the most out of the majority of their players? That's, to me, still a question mark for this defense heading into 2023.
If they can get some consistency, and I didn't know until you said it that there might be a little concern about how the back part of the depth chart was getting coached. That is a big no-no to me. You recruit everybody to get coached.
But part of the reason I'm giving him a mulligan on that is because he had to deal so much with the other crap from the veteran players. And because it was
I've
year
heard
one.
some of that too. Yeah.
Right. And it was year one. So
sometimes guys don't buy in, and that's a
right.
problem, bro.
And then you've got to spend all, like the way it usually works is I got this veteran player and I can just, I mean, I'll coach him up and work with him, but he helps me. Like one of the great things about when Harry Heastand's offensive line was rolling, when Quentin Nelson and Mike McGlinchey and Ronnie Stanley and Liam Eichenberg became seniors, and obviously that was after the last one was after Coach Heastand left. But honestly, those guys become almost like GAs to a degree. You know, where when you have Quentin Nelson, he's taking that young guard behind him, and he with Aaron Banks, and he's like, "Hey, man, coach you up and work with you on this, and leave these lessons with you." And so that takes some of that burden off of you, and it makes it easier for you to coach the entire depth chart, right? But when you're having to play, nanny to your starters and your fifth-year guys, it's like, what are you guys doing here? You know what I mean? And so I think that's why I'm willing to give Coach Washington a pass. And a lot of this is stuff that I learned in the offseason. And so it kind of makes you look back a little bit with a different perspective on some of the other things you heard. But that's not an issue anymore. Brian, you know Riley Mills. You've met Riley Mills. You've talked to Riley Mills. That's a kid that's in it for Notre Dame.
Oh, 100%.
Howard Cross is in it for Notre Dame, right? I mean, Javonte Jean-Baptiste is someone who had a pre-established relationship with Al Washington at Ohio State. There's going to be buy-in. If Javonte Jean-Baptiste did not know and respect Al Washington, he wouldn't have transferred to Notre Dame.
Yeah, he's the least of my concerns.
Right. Nana Osafo-Mensah is going to be bought in. He's become a leader. He's not, I don't think, going to be a starter, won't be an impact player, but he's a leader. The Donovan Hinish is going to be bought in. Gabe Rubio's bought in. Jason Onye's bought. So the buy-in is going to be greater this year. So I think that's why I'm willing to give Coach Washington a mulligan for year one, because I think some of that stuff is just like, what can you do there? You move on. Those guys are gone. Get these kids ready to play. But it's not. But you now got to show. So yes, I'm willing to give you a mulligan, but that doesn't mean I'm going to assume that you're great at it. You now have to prove that to me, and I still think that's my biggest question mark.
It's almost like he's getting a do-over in a sense, because this will be a more normal situation with extra depth too. Because your point about those freshmen, I remember going to the game. I forget who they played, but the year Anthony Weaver came to Notre Dame, I wasn't told anything. I mean, I knew members on the staff. Madison was at Notre Dame at the time, but Anthony Weaver started. And while I liked Anthony Weaver and I'd seen his film and all that, I'm like, great that he's starting, but then again, no, it's not. Because just like there's zero chance a freshman was going to start this year for Notre Dame.
Right.
Weaver was like a national top 50.
Unless he's a star. Unless he's an absolute star.
Weaver would have been like ranked between 50 and 100. He was good.
Right.
But he had to start because Notre Dame stunk up front. Notre Dame is not in that spot. So Al Washington, he may not have a Lamborghini. He's got something pretty
There's no
close.
Keon Keeley.
Yeah, right. But he's got a super group of kids.
Yeah.
And a lot of athletes, like Burnham in particular, could be Keon Keeley.
Correct.
He just changed position, so it's a wide open, and we have no idea. But there's not a lot of guys like Tyson Ford sitting third string in college football either.
Bingo.
Think about this, 6'5", 290, and until about a year ago, he was a freaking weak side end. That he just got big, and then, okay, well, you're going to play inside now.
And so there are a lot of teams in the top 25 that would love to have a Boubacar Traore, an Armel Mukam, a Brendan Vernon, a Devin Houston. Yeah.
If Traore went to Iowa and they can coach, their staff is phenomenal. If he went there, he would be in there too deep by the end of fall camp.
So would Vernon.
Guarantee. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like Vernon fits Iowa to a T in terms of personality. But yeah, Notre Dame is in a situation where when they, at the end of games, when you're up by 20, 30 points, used to be, it always pissed me off because Notre Dame would go up, but then they put in backups and the score would not be indicative because the last two drives for Navy or Michigan State or whoever it was, they'd score touchdowns. And instead of winning by 4 scores, it's 2. That guy in the national media who hates Notre Dame anyway, seems, well, Notre Dame wins 35-21 instead of 35-7 is like, they crushed this team. 35-21, whatever. You know what I mean? That matters. Notre Dame's not putting in a guy like, look, Vernon's going to play as hard. I don't know if he'll be any good this year.
Right.
Let's say he's 4th team. The guy in front of him with 3 minutes to go in the game better be ready to play.
Yeah.
or he will plant him on his rear end.
Yeah.
Notre Dame has never had fourth-team guys like that, ever.
Right.
So they should be able to finish games strong. The reps should come down from the starters. At the end of the year, games 10 through 12, if we're looking at these numbers, and I assume you're getting up PFF, wherever you're getting them from, if they're anywhere near what they were last year for some guys, then I'm going to get real worried.
Yes.
Because something is going, unless there's a ton
something
of
has gone wrong, or you're just not willing to coach. And this is where, and Brian, lean up just a little bit, because I'm having trouble. You're not picking up. We're not picking you up as well on the mic when you lean back. But this is why the article I wrote the other day with Coach Freeman is important, because he said we're going to play younger kids and we have a plan to make it happen. Great. I love the words. Love the words.
See it. Let's see
I
it.
need to see it. I need to see it. And this is
100%.
one of those positions where it's important, because, as you said, a defensive lineman that's got heavy legs in the fourth quarter is not getting to the quarterback in today's game. Just not happening.
No, especially with all the quick game they do.
Exactly.
With a few reps that you get, a 5-step drop, man, you gotta maximize, because it's less than 3 seconds on most throws. So it is what it is.
Right. So let's have couple bold predictions here each, Brian. These are meant to just be kind of fun. It's not saying, okay, I guarantee that so-and-so is going to have 25 sacks. Just have a little bit of fun of something we think could happen this year that, may not be a normal prediction. I gave one earlier. I think one of the freshmen is going to play a lot of football this year and be a pretty good player, be a little bit of a breakout for Notre Dame. I think if I had to pick, it would be, like I said, one of the big ends, Boubacar Traore, Armel Mukam, or Brendan Vernon. That's my first bold prediction, Brian. What is one bold prediction that you have for the 2023 Notre Dame defensive line?
40 or more sacks is the bottom end, and I think they'll get 45.
So would you say that you're looking at 30 plus for the D-line this year, or 40 for the D-line this year?
I think
38 as a team last year, 29 as a defensive line.
I think there'll be at least 35 from the D-line, to be honest with you, and I'm counting the Viper just for the rec. Botelho should be at 8, like at least, because they have so much depth. He's going to be with guys everybody has to be accounted for.
Should be at least 15 with him and Riley Mills alone. I mean, that's
if it's not, then my prediction is going into the crapper.
Yeah.
So look, your best guys have to produce the biggest stats. It's not a news flash. The Yankees need Aaron Judge to hit home runs.
Yes.
So I'm going to go 45 sacks. And I'll also, just for the fun, I'll say Tyson Ford gets at least 4. And he's a third-team guy. That's why I say it. When you have third-team guys do that, again, it's a testament to either getting some coaching and all that stuff. We've got depth. Like in the fourth quarter against Tennessee State, and I assume he'll be playing then. If he's not, I'm concerned. That should be a game where somebody at quarterback, for whoever it is, for that poor guy, I don't know who this kid is. He's probably not any good. And he gets smacked underneath the chops. When you have third-team guys like that, you can be a top 10 team, compete for the playoff. Georgia and some of the teams that make it, Clemson, etc., even that 218 Clemson team, all the stars were really good. They were insanely good. But they still had guys off the bench that would have started for pretty much any other school in the ACC. They waited their turn and just rotated in. And that's why they were so freaking good. It was like, are you kidding me? There was no pass rush play that you could take off. Notre Dame, I'm not saying they got one of the high-end guys like Clemson does, but maybe they end up – Mills could be a 10-sack guy.
Right.
It wouldn't shock me. Botelho could be a 10-sack guy. It wouldn't shock me.
Well, Brian, look at the bowl game last year. You had Riley inside at 3 technique. You had Botelho starting at Viper, and those two kids combined for 3 tackles for loss, and was it 3.5 tackles for loss and 3 sacks, right? So Riley had a tackle,
and that's against the
next
SEC team. It wasn't like they were going against chumps. Yeah,
right. He had 1.5 tackles for loss and a sack. Jordan Botelho had 2 tackles for loss, both of them sacks. Gabriel Rubio had a tackle for loss last year. And that kind of leads into one of my bold predictions, and that is that Notre Dame's defensive line in 23 will outproduce the Clemson defensive line in 22. So last year, Clemson's defensive line produced 56.5 tackles for loss and 26 sacks. The sacks should be easy. Notre Dame had more sacks than Clemson did last year. It's the run game production. So my prediction basically comes down to, I think Notre Dame is going to have 25 more tackles for, actually, you know what? I'm gonna up that. That's not bold enough. That's not really bold. Notre Dame's going to have 30 more tackles for loss than they do sacks this year on the defensive line. That's going to be my prediction. So basically, I'm predicting, my bold prediction is the run game production for the defensive line is going to be a lot better this year. It's easy, like the sacks to me, that can be misleading. You can have a lot of sacks because you had like when you're up 27 and you could just pin your ears back and rack up 3 sacks in the fourth quarter. The number to me that really defines that this is a big time defensive line is the gap between your number of sacks and your run stops grows. And I've talked about this for a couple years now. And Notre Dame had way too close of a gap the last couple years from their defensive line in the number of sacks and total tackles for loss, which meant not as much run game production. I think that changes this year because of the style of play they're going to have, and then also the specific players they're going to have. They're going to be bigger, more athletic at the 3 technique. They're going to be way more twitchy and elusive-y linebacker-y types at Viper. They may not be as good of players individually as Isaiah Foskey, but if Isaiah Foskey came back and I was designing the defense the way that I wanted to design the defense, I'm moving him over to the field end, and I'm still going to have the same Vipers this year that I had. That's what I would do. And so to me, they're just more pure Viper type of players, which to me leads to more disruptions, Brian. That's basically what it boils down to. So that's my bold prediction. They're going to have 30 more tackles for loss than they have sacks from the defensive line position. So those are my 2.
Sorry, are you saying in your estimation, just from a sheer volume standpoint, I'm guessing you're going to figure they're going to get at least as many sacks this year, give or take, within a couple, one way or the other, upper 60s?
I could actually, Brian, see
maybe even 70?
I actually could see the defensive line sack numbers going down a little bit this year. Yeah, because and it goes back to something you said earlier in the show. If the defensive line, I felt the defensive line last year got some, I don't say garbage sacks, but like late game sacks against bad team sacks that
they did.
That you're like, that wasn't really a money sack, right? Where I look at this team. He had 6 sacks against Cal, 4 against UNLV, 4 against Syracuse, 4 against Boston College. He had 1 against Ohio State.
Not good enough. Not good enough.
Right. So I could see a scenario where the teams have to spend, and this goes back to your point, teams have to spend so much energy trying to stop the defensive line that J.D. Bertrand gets 5 sacks. That the Will linebacker gets 4 or 5 sacks. So Jack Kaiser gets 3. So I could see the sack numbers being around where they were, 25 to 30, but then the run stop tackles for loss numbers take a big jump. Because again, what it leads to is more run game tackle production means more second and longs, more third and longs, which then leads to more third down blitz packages where it's actually Jack Kaiser that gets the sack, or Maris Luafau, or Nolan Ziegler, or Jalen Sneed. Like I could see Jalen Sneed being one of the 3 or 4 most productive pass rushers this year because of using his speed off the edge. And you're trying to deal with Javonte Jean-Baptiste and Riley Mills and Jordan Botelho and Josh Burnham, and all of a sudden this little 6'1.5", 225 pounds, explosive kid off the edge is coming at you. Nolan Ziegler shooting the B gap, or Jack Kaiser's coming off the edge, who's also a pretty decent blitzer. J.D. Bertrand's coming up the middle. So I actually think that if the D-line is as good as I hope it can be, you're actually going to see the sack numbers not make a big jump for the defensive line. It's going to be the linebackers, because we talked about how the defensive line only had 29 sacks last year, which was more than Ohio State, was more than Michigan, more than Clemson, more than their defensive lines had. Well, here's the counter argument to that. You didn't have a whole lot of sack production from the second and third levels. And when you look at the numbers last year, they had 2.5 sacks from the secondary. Tariq Bracy had a sack, Xavier Watts had a sack, and Ramon Henderson had a half a sack. So, my math isn't the greatest here, Brian. That means the linebackers only had 6.5 sacks last year. I think that's going to shoot way up this year if the run game production is better from the defensive line. So that's kind of where I think the sack numbers for now, to your point, Brian, your total team sack numbers, I'm with you on. I just think because if the defensive line is as good as I think it's going to be from a disruption standpoint, that's actually going to lead to more sack production. So, like, here's another example. Riley Mills comes screaming up the middle, blows up the left guard, just dominates him. Quarterback has to step up and slide, and J.D. Bertrand's looping around to sack.
There you go.
That's what I'm referring to. So more of that type of stuff.
I could see Bertrand ending up being he's going to play the most snaps, I would assume, at linebacker. He got 6 sacks, and he's got Baptiste and Botelho, etc. They're all just playing good. They don't have to be dominant. Where you literally and legitimately on every play have to account for all 4 of the linemen, then, it's a nightmare when somebody's as extinct. Like Bertrand's really instinctive, not like kind of. Like he is really instinctive. He's going to find himself a couple of coverage sacks,
Brian, I said this in the show the other day. If JD played the same number of snaps in 22 that he played in 21, but kept his production per snap basis that he had in 22, he's an 11.5 tackle for loss guy. And that's with him not doing a whole lot in the pass game. So to the other point, too, I want to answer a question. Somebody actually had this. Scoob asked, if a sack counts as a tackle for loss. Yes. So the way to figure out in college football, if you get a sack, it counts as a tackle for loss. So if a guy has 2 sacks and 2 tackles for loss in the stat sheet, that means both of his tackles for loss were sacks. So when you look at Notre Dame last year, the defensive line had 46.5 tackles for loss, 29 sacks. That means 29 of those tackles for loss were sacks. 17.5 of those tackles for loss were run stops behind the line. Not run stuffs, but run stops. Because a run stuff is I tackle the guy at the line of scrimmage. That's not a tackle for loss. No, those are important too, right? So a stuff is anything from 0 beyond. But I'm referring to specifically to tackles for loss, the disruptives, the negatives, creating more negatives. And so like I said, Notre Dame was 17.5. Ohio State last year was 24.5 was the number between their tackles for loss and sacks. That means they had 24 sacks, 24.5 tackles for loss, which equals 24.5 run game stops for losses, which means 48.5 tackles for loss. So that's how that comes down to. It's a combination basically of sacks and negatives in the run game is what it boils down to. So that's how those are factored in. And those can be, I say run game, but it could also be a screen that you blow up behind the line. That also counts as a tackle for loss. I think Tariq Bracy actually had a few tackles for loss last year. He had 6. Tariq Bracy had 6 tackles for loss last year in a sack. At least half of those tackles for loss were not him blitzing off the edge. I think at least 4 of them, 4 or 5 of them,
screenplays
were him blowing up a screen. Correct. So
he was very fundamental. He'd been coached up, and he earned it.
He's very underrated player last year. Very underrated player. So that's kind of where we're at for the defensive line, Brian. Going to be a fun year to follow it. Folks, we're going to go to the mailbag next, so don't leave. But before we do, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. If you like what Brian Smith brought to the table today, it's why you need to subscribe to the CFB Nation channel, because I believe next week we decided, Brian, next week you're going to launch your first round of shows.
That is correct.
We're going to have on CFB Nation, so Southeastern recruiting. Brian's going to start breaking down because the 2025 class is loaded nationally, Brian. It's really loaded in the Southeast. And so each day, I think we're going to do offense this week, Brian, and then defense the next week. We're going to kind of split it up into position groups, and he's just going to kind of give you some names to know from a high school recruiting standpoint. So again, CFB Nation is not a Notre Dame channel. It is our college football channel. That doesn't mean we won't talk about kids that are interested in Notre Dame and all that, but there's a ton, including a running back in the 25 class that Notre Dame is very high on.
I happen to know him.
Yes, bro. You had him on your show recently. So those shows are now going to start being on the CFB Nation channel. So you definitely want to subscribe to that. I'm actually going to put a link in that as well. Also, if you are someone who listens to the Lucky Lefty podcast with Sean Davis and Malik Zaire, that show also, starting on July 1st, is going to be exclusively found on CFB Nation. I'm putting the link in the box, the chat below, so you can check on that. Do us a favor. Go there and subscribe, right? We greatly appreciate if you guys would do that for us. And I'm going to see how many of you, I'm actually going to go look at the numbers here real quick, Brian, and see how many people did that yesterday, because I have a way to track what our numbers were. So I'm going to see how many of you actually listened to me yesterday and did that. So let's see here. See what our numbers are up to for there. So we had about 9. So not enough of you. Go to the CFB Nation podcast app right now and subscribe to that, because Brian's going to be on there. Brian and I, we've talked about this. We will do some shows together too, previewing college football. I'll be on some shows with Vince there. We're going to have a lot of fun, man. We're going to do a lot of crossover stuff, but you're only going to get those shows on the CFB Nation podcast. So check that out. And it's part of the Irish Breakdown family. So it is mailbag time, Brian, and we got Ryan bring these up. So we're going to just get rocking and rolling here. We're going to start off with Bobby Halfacre. He says, I know the narrative about every year is different of team, but what's your honest opinion of the defense as a whole unit? I'm going to say this, Brian, and this is something that I think we had. One of the things we're doing on Irish Breakdown Premium Board, which is why you need to sign up at boards.irishbreakdown.com, is we launched this week's first time. So Ryan does a recruiting mailbag every week where people ask him recruiting questions and he'll answer them. But we're doing sort of a team chat. So it's basically something that's running throughout the week. It's I think 10 pages long already. I put it up, I think, Tuesday night. It's already 10 pages long, where you can ask us questions. And one of the questions was, do you think the Notre Dame offense is being undersold? And my response was, I don't really think so for the most part. There are some people that just give Notre Dame no love, but there's a lot of people that are just kind of assuming Notre Dame's going to be a lot better on offense this year. I don't know if anybody thinks they're going to be this juggernaut, but most people think they're going to get a lot better. The part of the team that I think is being wildly undersold is the defense. And I think it includes Notre Dame fans. There's this notion from Notre Dame fans that the defense was bad last year. It wasn't bad at all. It wasn't as good as it needed to be. It wasn't as good as it should have been. And there were some frustrating moments, but this is also a defense that held Clemson and Ohio State to an average of 17.5 points. This is a defense last year that ranked 12th in college football in Power 5 games in total defense and rushing defense, and was top 25 in yards per play, rushing yards per play, passing yards per play, and scoring against Power 5 opponents. And there was about 3 to 6 non-Power 5 teams, meaning teams play like 1 to 3 games against Power 5s, in those numbers ahead of them. So they were a top 10 team in Power 5 games this year in a lot of categories. That's a struggling defense. Now, do they need to get better? Yes, they do need to get better. But I actually think this defense is going to be a lot better this year, Brian, for 2 reasons. Number one, I think this is a team that has a lot more talent than Notre Dame fans are willing to give it credit for.
Agreed.
And number two, I don't care how bad you are as a coach, you get better in year 2. Brian Van Gorder's defense got a lot better in year 2 than it was in year 1. Right? I mean, that's just a fact. Brian Van Gorder's first defense gave up 29.2 points per game. His next defense gave up 24.1 points per game. Same players. His 24 defense, his 2014 defense gave up 444.9 yards per game. Oh, I'm sorry, 404.2 yards per game. And his 2015 defense gave up 372.7 yards per game against a tougher schedule, because you played 3 top 5 teams that year in 2015. Right. So if Brian Van Gorder can get a 30 to 40 yard jump improvement and a over 5 point per game improvement on defense, Al Gold can freaking do that as well with a much better baseline to start with. Because I know the defense gave up 23 points per game last year, Brian, but can we not ignore the fact that Notre Dame had a weird number of pick sixes? What they give up, like 3 pick six? They gave up 4 pick sixes last year, right? You gave up 2 in the bowl game. Gave up 1 against Marshall. Was it 3? Was it 3 last year? Let me go look at this real quick. Yeah, 3. So you gave up 3 of those last season. So you just take those away just by themselves, and the defense is down to 21.4 points per game. Not good enough. Needs to be better, but it's still good. So I actually think the defense is going to be pretty good. I think they're going to be a top 15 defense. The question is, Brian, will they be a top 10 defense or potentially a creep up on the top 5? That remains to be seen. But I'm very confident this is going to be a top 15 caliber defense. They're going to do a much better job to get some of the lower level teams in the schedule, because I think it just comes down to the knowledge of the system and the coach's knowledge of the players. And I think we're going to see Coach Freeman a little bit more involved in the defense this year, just because he's got a better grasp of where he's at. So I think he's going to be a little bit more involved with both of his coaching staffs to make sure that they're all on the same page with what they're putting in. And I think the third reason, actually I said 2, but here's the third reason, Brian. I do think the offense is going to be a lot better. And the better you are on offense, the better it is for your defense. Because if the offense can come out and put 17 points on their first 3 possessions, and all of a sudden you got a 17-13 lead, it's pin your ears back and let's go after them.
Sure.
And so I think that's going to – I mean, if the Notre Dame offense would have done against Stanford what they did in the first half, Stanford doesn't get to 10 points in that game because the defense would just overwhelm them in the second half. That's just what would have happened. So I think those are the things that you look at too, Brian, and say the offense is also going to help this defense get better. So I think they were a top 25 defense last year. I think they're going to be a top 15 defense this year. That's not good enough to win a championship. So that's just a fact. It needs to be top 10 if they're going to be a championship team, in my opinion. And that's the bigger question right now. But I have zero doubt that this is going to be a noticeably better defense this season than it was a year ago. That's not even to me something I'm even willing to entertain. Is it not happening? I do not see them regressing on defense this year.
I think 2 things from what you said. Number one, I think towards the end of the year, they'll be able to be a little more timely because they're deeper, especially in the front 7. So fewer snaps. I mean, it's just numbers again. This isn't real shocking information here, but I'd rather my star D lineman being at 450 than 550 going into the bowl game. And I'd also like my linebackers to be able to rotate more. I'm sure you've talked about linebackers or will. And it's the same concept at every spot, though. They have enough depth now where the starter isn't out there on first, second, and third down 80% of the time. So that's going to be one. And I also think that this year, too, I remember listening to one of your shows recently with Ryan. They finally admitted, okay, we put in all this stuff last year. We didn't use A, B, and C, so they chucked it. And they could focus on things. Well, when you focus on less, it's easier to learn. So, and it's year 2. There's no reason for them not to streamline based on that and also be good at it. So, yeah, the defense, I think, overall will be more timely, and it'll also be deeper. It'll also have less attrition. I mean, they're in a much better spot.
Again, but what's the question? Will they be championship caliber? That's going to take more than just experience in the system.
They need some guys to dominate. Yeah, Ben Morrison was a championship level guy last year. Freaking freshman.
Right.
Now Riley Mills and a couple other guys.
Cam Hart, Xavier Watts,
Yeah,
right.
I mean,
will some of the guys that struggled get beat out, or will Maris play better, or will they get beat out? There's just a lot of those things that need to happen, no doubt.
Yep. That's why they play the games, bro.
That's right. It's favorite part about it. Jordan Schreiber said, did Logan Diggs show up on the top 10 running backs list, or was he left off with Audric? I guess I don't quite understand what you're referring to, Jordan, as far as top 10 list. I don't know of any lists where Logan Diggs is ranked as a top 10 running back. I don't know.
If he is, that's the list I'm unaware of too.
Yeah. So now if you're referring to the team list, I know Phil Steele had the Notre Dame backfield ranked, I think 9th or 10th in his preseason magazine. And the one thing I like there's a lot I don't like about Phil Steele's magazine. It's so wordy. I don't even understand what half the things mean. He just kind of like assumes we're all supposed to know what all his abbreviations and all this stuff means. But one thing I do like about it is he puts a lot of value in waiting longer to get it out to make sure that there's more updated rosters and things along those lines. So when he actually did his ranking of the top 10 backfields, not only did he have not having Logan Diggs, he had them adding Devin Ford.
Wow.
So it was very updated. Oh, yeah. It was very updated. And he still had Notre Dame as a top 10 backfield. I shouldn't say backfield, running back. Because when I think backfield, I think quarterback and running back. Top 10 running back groups. So, yeah, I thought highly of that. But I don't know of anyone that has Logan Diggs as a top 10 guy in Audric. So maybe, Jordan, if you can follow up on that, just kind of elaborate, we'll gladly answer that question later. Rob Osgood asks, how much of an improvement do you think we will see with the D-line in year 2 of Al Washington and an Al Golden defense? Thank you. Brian, you want to take a crack at that one? Basically, how much of an improvement do you think we'll see from the D-line, especially in year 2 with Al Washington as their coach and also with Al Golden running the defense?
I think that it'll be because of simplification. How often have you and I talked about we hate the paralysis by analysis? It's Notre Dame fans probably think it's only their school. Trust me, I go on message boards across the country. It's a bitching and moaning fest about that at a lot of places. I think the simplified defense is going to allow for him to make it easier for his players. And as we just went over for an hour and a half, Notre Dame has a ton of young talent. There is no reason that my dead grandmother couldn't get this unit to get 20 sacks, okay? They got players. Now, can you get that niche? How I'm going to grade him isn't whether they're better. It's whether they're better against Ohio State,
Right.
Clemson, USC, NC State, teams that matter. Because if I'm worried about what they did against teams that were like Stanford, then this season didn't end up like you and I thought it should anyhow.
Yep.
That's just honest. I'm not trying to be mad at Stanford or anything. Notre Dame should slaughter Stanford, not beat. This next year, that should be 45-10.
And to your point, Brian, is if we look at the end of the year and the numbers are great, but the numbers were because they had 13 tackles for loss against Stanford and Navy and Tennessee State, and they had 8 sacks and a win over Tennessee State, then it doesn't matter to me. At the end of the day, like, you know what I loved about the Lou Holtz era is there were some of those Notre Dame teams where it was like hair pulling out hair watching them play against inferior teams because they would just kind of like toy with them because you could just tell they weren't up for that game. They were thinking about, but man, that team was always ready to play at its best in the big moments. Like, you know, like what was the one year that they probably should have been a champ? Was it 92?
92, they should have won the national title. They
absolutely
choked against Stanford in the second. They were up 16-0 and lost.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the Michigan game, Lou didn't do a good job managing the clock.
Right.
They should have been able to kick a field goal. They didn't get it done.
But if they beat Stanford that year, then I mean they beat a top 10 BC team 54-7. They beat a
I know when they wanted to.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
They beat number 2 22 Penn State that year. They beat number 19 USC on the road that year. They whooped number 4 Texas A&M that year. If they just tie Michigan, they're playing for the national championship. Brian, they were ranked 5th at the end of the year going into the bowl game, and that was with a loss to Stanford and a tie to Michigan. If they just beat Stanford, they're just up for that game the way that they were for some of the other games. They're playing for the championship that year. There's no question about it. And so that's just one of those things where, man, I would have loved to see Notre Dame playing Alabama or Miami in the postseason that year. Like that would have been.
Could you imagine how physical the Notre Dame Alabama game would have been? That would have been
really good Alabama front because that was John Copeland, Eric Curry. That would have been
that DN combo was the best in college football that year. Yep. Notre Dame would have had a harder time running the ball in that game for sure.
Yeah, but now that Texas A&M team that Notre Dame ran the ball on in the second half had some dudes as well. Yeah, but
in the second half they folded like it's in. Notre Dame beat the crap out of them.
Oh yeah, that would have been a great game. Great game to watch that Alabama team against that Notre Dame team. That would have been a lot of fun to watch. But the point is, you know, like you said, Brian, it's that's what the great teams do. It's are you up for like Alabama almost never lose. Like that's what made last year so weird. They never lose. They never lost in big games under Saban ever. They would lose to a not very great Auburn team. They lose to Ole Miss. They lose to A&M before anybody knew A&M was going to be good that year. They never lost to Georgia in the regular season. They never lost to when Tennessee's ranked high or when Florida or whoever. I mean, they always win those big games because that team's always they get tripped up by some team. You're like, Ohio State was that way for a long time under Urban. They would smack Michigan, smack Penn State. They'd go lose to Virginia Tech at home by 2 touchdowns. They go get blown out by Iowa, get blown out by Purdue. And then the next week play a top 10 Michigan State team and beat them by 50. You know what I mean? Like, but that's the thing is if Notre Dame, and that was the thing under Brian Kelly. Brian Kelly never lost games, and from 17 on, never lost games to inferior opponents. He lost games to almost most of his games to teams that were on their level because he couldn't get them up for those games. I feel like with this defense, it's can you get your guys ready to play in the big moments, scheme-wise, attitude-wise, play-wise, all those type of things. Because when you look at the big games, Brian, USC and Ohio State are both completely revamping their offensive lines this year. And Ohio State had to go to the portal after the spring to get a kid from San Diego State. Who's a nice player. But my whole point is he's like a fifth-year senior. If he was that good, he's going to go to the NFL, not transfer to Ohio State, right? I mean, that's the reality of it. And, so you got to take advantage.
Yeah. Think about the depth they had at the end from the time, say, 13, 14 to about 2020. It's dropped off. It really, I don't know what the deal is. They're not the same, but I mean, they're still good.
Well, no, I was talking about the Ohio State offensive line.
Oh, no, I was talking about D-line. Okay.
Yeah, no. Yeah. Your Ohio State's offensive line is revamped. USC's offensive line is revamped. So the point is in those matchups, USC had like 3 sixth-year seniors in their offensive line last year. They're gone. Ohio State had a first-round pick in Paris Johnson at left tackle. Luke Whippler was an all Big Ten center. DeJuan Jones was an all Big Ten right tackle. Got picked, I think,
third or fourth round?
Ryan would know. He's in there. Ryan would know what round he was picked in. But they lost some really good players, and they haven't recruited that position extremely well in years leading up to this. So that's what I was saying is they had to. Ryan said third round, so they had a top 10 pick at left one tackle, a third round pick at another tackle, and with Luke Whippler, to me, I think the only reason he didn't get drafted higher, and this is just my opinion, is because he's just undersized, but he was still a 6th-round draft pick. So they lost 3 NFL draft picks from their offensive line, and they're not like Notre Dame was under Harry Hiestand, where when you lose Zach Martin, you replace him with Ronnie Stanley. When you lose Ronnie Stanley, you replace him with Mike McGlinchey. When you lose Mike McGlinchey, you replace him with Liam Eichenberg. When you lose Liam Eichenberg, you replace him with Joe Walt and Blake Fisher. You know what I mean? Like, Ohio State's not there right now. And so that adds to, Brian, the importance of this is exactly why you need to be taking those games over, because you're not going against a superior group of players. Well, no, like guy in our chat, Archer, love Archer. Ohio State fan that's in our chat all the time. Awesome. But he's always talking about, how the D-line's unproven. And my counter to that would be, well, it's not nearly as unproven as the offensive linemen that you're going to be putting on the field this year in place of the guys you lost. And so which of those wins that battle? To your point, Brian, that's going to be the key, is if Notre Dame can go out there in a game where they should win that battle, can they? Because last year, simply put, Ohio State kicked Notre Dame's butt in the trenches, both sides of the ball, flat out, full stop, no excuses. That's why they won that football game, because they whooped Notre Dame's butt in the trenches. Clemson, now fast forward to Clemson, completely opposite. Notre Dame dominated Clemson in the trenches. They've got to be able to do that in all the big games this year, not just, okay, you did good here, did well there. And to me, that's going to be the biggest story from the Ohio State game is their D-line is going to be very good this year. Very good, in my opinion. Their offensive line, we'll see. This is one of those games where Joe Rudolph needs to go make his money, and Al Washington needs to make his money. That's going to be key.
I wonder, and again, I'm not picking on whatever guy it ends up being for the Bucs. C.J. Stroud made plays in the Georgia game that you cannot teach.
Right.
When to step up, exactly how far. Because Georgia should have sacked him about 5 more times than they did. He's not playing.
Right.
I'm not saying Notre Dame is going to get as much pressure on him as UGA did.
You could have argued that in the Ohio State game too, Brian. How many big plays did he make against Notre Dame where he was throwing on the run and getting the ball out on the sideline?
He was money on a couple of throws where you're like, come on. It was very, very deflating when you get a guy outside the pocket throwing against his body, etc. And not only is it a good throw, it's like, there's nothing you can do when the guy just puts it on the money. That's the one play you just, okay, whatever. But that's 3rd and 8 or something. That sucks the life out of your body. So I think that Notre Dame is going to get more pressure than they did last year, A, and B, it's not CJ. The chances of those kind of plays happening with the first-year starter not named C.J. Stroud go way down. So unless Ohio State can run the ball, and I have no idea, maybe they will.
And that's going to be a key. That's going to be a key.
If Notre Dame gives up 5.5 yards a carry, it's not going to matter. They're going to beat Notre Dame.
Yep. Because this year, unlike last year, you have to worry about, can this defense, like I have no doubt they're going to be able to get after the quarterback against Ohio State. That's one thing they actually did a decent job of last year. Riley Mills had some pressures. Howard Cross had some pressures. He just made great plays. Were forcing him out of, and exactly, made great plays. To me, C.J. Stroud, if I'm an NFL team, the Georgia game tells me a lot, but the Notre Dame game did too. Because he wasn't on his game from throwing it all over the yard and doing, but he made the tough plays when he needed to make the tough plays. That's what I learned a lot about C.J. Stroud. He hadn't really been disrupted like that, he hadn't played a secondary like that up to that point in time, in my opinion, that could get after them. And then you lose Jackson Smith and Jigba, and he's got a much younger group of players, all that kind of stuff. He showed me a lot of something in that game. Are you going to ask this young guy to do that? Because in CJ's first year, CJ put up a lot of numbers, but they were somewhat hollow numbers. They were system numbers. And so like the Oregon game, he threw a ton of yards against Oregon.
Yeah, they were getting killed and they didn't win the game. They didn't
matter. So that's going to be the question mark. But that's going to be dependent on what Notre Dame does. Can you take advantage of that? There's no excuses this year, and that's the question that we're going to learn. So great question, Rob. Caleb Collins says, what do you think is the percentage of RPOs Notre Dame runs this season? I would imagine, I'm just going to throw a guess out here. I would say they're going to run RPOs on at least 60% of their runs this year. Now, keep in mind, an RPO percentage is not the times they pull and throw it; it's the time they have an RPO called. Because I love RPOs, Brian. You know that. Everybody knows that. But if I'm running an offense, I'm not calling an RPO on every snap. There's sometimes I want that ball handed off. We're running this, and we're handing that sucker off, and we're blocking. I think you have to, like everything, you have to mix that up. If they know you're going to be doing RPOs every time, then they can play that way. But if you don't know if I'm going to be down blocking, so if your safety's playing for RPOs, but I've got Deion Colzier, Jaden Thomas running down there, you think he's going to try to run a post route on you, but he's really just coming down there and stalk block you, he's going to dominate you. And all of a sudden, my running back's bouncing off behind that block 9 yards down the field, and we're off to the races, right? And so, to me, you've got to mix it up like you do anything else. I would probably be around 65, 70%. I think Notre Dame will be a little under that and be around 60% is my guess. That's a full 100% guess of where they'll be, which is significantly higher than where they were last year. I'd say they were maybe 10 to 15%, maybe 20%.
I never understood that. I don't want anyone to get on that discussion, but with a 6-year quarterback that has thrown 110 touchdowns coming out of a slow mesh offense who's used to basically running play action on every play, that's essentially what it is. It would behoove Notre Dame to be over 50% conservatively in the run game, because if you're going to challenge somebody like Jaden Thomas has got a one-on-one with no safety help, he can take it off your head. Why not throw it up? 3rd and 1 becomes 4th and 1 and number 7's here. We're good. That's just how I look at it. Oh,
sorry. And you've got Joe Alt and Blake Fisher and Zeke Correll and Bill. Yeah, exactly. I think when you've got the line they have with Audric Estime and the vet and look, the receiving core, you can say what you want about Tommy Rees. The receiving core wasn't great last year. Now, it wasn't as bad as some people say. It was thin. You had issues there. Lorenzo Styles' head was not in the game. Tobias was a freshman. Deion was not healthy early. There was a lot of problems. Jaden Thomas didn't play very well early in the year. There was a lot of issues last year. Now, the receiving core, second half of the year, much better than the numbers would reflect. But I don't know that you could argue they had a receiving core last year that you should have built a million RPOs around. But you should have done it more than you did, in my opinion. And especially, I would have done it with more RPO stuff, Brian. I would have had a lot of stuff tagged in out of 21 personnel where I'm reading inside zone. I'm going old school. Remember, like when Northwest was doing under Randy Walker back in the day, where they would go, you read that inside zone, and then you got a guy, Chris Tyree swinging around on a swing route where I'm reading that flat that. You know what I mean?
Like this pass becomes a 30-yard game.
Exactly. So you could have done some stuff like that, but I'm it is what it is. Last year's last year. I expect a lot more of that this year, partly because there's a lot more weapons out there and a lot older weapons out there and better attitudes out there. And just if you think about it, they have everybody coming back from last year's receiving core, except for Braden Lindsey, who was much better than his numbers showed last year, and Lorenzo Styles, who had a bad year, in my opinion. Arriving to the receiving core is Chris Tyree, Jaden Greathouse, Braylon James, Rico Flores Jr., and Caleb Smith. And all your returners are now a year older. So I think there's more weapons to deal with there. And so that's another reason I think we're going to see a lot more of that, on top of, I just think Jared Parker believes in doing that more than I think Coach Rees did. And it was just a different style of play. But I also don't know that Tommy Rees, and I understand this, I don't know that Tommy Rees necessarily trusted Drew Pine to read those things out properly, to be honest with you.
Unfortunately, that can get you in a lot of trouble, because a misread in any way.
Yep. Because to your point, Brian, they weren't in a misread an RPO on 1st and 10 and getting 2nd 10. This team was not a team that was going to escape from a lot of 2nd and 3rd.
And I get that's why they were conservative and ran the ball. They wanted 2nd and 7 at worst.
Right.
And with the guys they had at running back, look, they were pretty damn good. So I understand.
Right. Next question is from Brandon Plesner. He says, Smitty, any takeaways from the Future 50? Who stood out and what Notre Dame targets impressed you?
Oh, real
quick. So for those who don't know, every year, Under Armour. Is it still at Disney, Ryan? Is it still at that?
No.
Where was it at?
The Future 50s at IMG.
IMG, okay.
Yeah, they do.
So basically, top recruits from the 2020 it's really the rising junior class.
It'll be juniors in high school, but
right. So they work out, they go through drills. There was a lot of NFL players you said there this year, Brian, like working these kids out. Like you said, Justin Jefferson was like working with the receivers.
Him and Kyle Hamilton showed up.
It's a 2-day thing, right? They
Yeah.
show up and talk on day one, and then the next day they work out, something like that, I believe. So that's what they're referring to, Brian. So, so from a Notre Dame standpoint, who are some guys that stood out, and just some little nuggets that, because I know there's a couple guys that I was very happy to hear have some legit interest in Notre Dame.
Well, for one, just to reiterate what you'd mentioned earlier, I interviewed Botelho, and I know him pretty well. The 3 in-state schools in Notre Dame are his list, and I'm not going to get into the full analysis of it. He is a national top 10 kid. Anybody that wants to say otherwise, they're wrong. He is a freakazoid that can play in the slot against the 5'9", 170 kid, or he can take on an offensive guard and get off of him, scrape, and chase down a kid on the sideline. He is a freakazoid. He didn't even work out this time. I'd seen him in practice. Didn't care. He was just there hanging out. He goes to IMG too. So that Notre Dame must get him. For those who don't know, a certain guy that is now playing for the Cleveland Browns is his brother. And he played at Notre Dame. The best guys.
Real quick, too, is I'll remind people that Ryan has an article on the front page at Irish Breakdown where he talked to Nathaniel. Yes, definitely read this. You can see that they're actually doing a really good job of recruiting him so far. And the nice thing is he's actually never been to Notre Dame before.
He shot when he told me, because I asked him about it. He said, I've never been. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know why I didn't get into it. There was a whole bunch of us in a scrum interviewing him, but I was like,
yeah. So it's interesting. So if you're already there and your brother, and that's the thing I was encouraged by to hear Ryan say that his brother's talking to him a lot about Notre Dame. So there's already that strong baseline, and he's not even been to campus yet. So I was actually more encouraged coming out of what you told me about your conversation with him, and then what Ryan's article did. I was a lot more optimistic than I was a couple weeks ago.
The kid that and this is just a personal pet peeve, Driscoll mentioned this when we opened the show. I talk a lot about D-line and corner, and it's for one reason. Notre Dame usually struggles to get these guys. There was a kid there. He plays at St. Francis. They play IMG every year. It's their rival, if you will. So that puts things in perspective in terms of talent. His name is Blake Woodby. He's a corner who can fly. I watched him because I was literally filming it, and he about ran into me at the end of it. He ran 4.41 electronic. Dude can fly. Notre Dame has a chance to get a visit pretty soon. He can go to any school in the country. Notre Dame needs more kids from the St. Francis's of the world. I'm shocked. They haven't got a St. Francis kid yet, have they?
No, they're at least trying to recruit DC better, but they're just, for whatever reason, just not having any success with that Catholic league in the DC area.
In his own words, Blake told me that Notre Dame's corner coach, Mickens, was his guy.
Yeah.
What that means?
Shocker.
He's a really good recruiter, and I've met him. He's just an easygoing guy. I can see why kids can relate to him. There are a handful of other kids that are interested, but the offensive guys are more in wait and see mode. I know that's not exactly a shocker either. I mean, especially if you're a wide receiver. I mean, it's kind of hard to pick Notre Dame right now, and I get it, but they've done pretty good. A few of the O-linemen might be possibilities, but they're going to be tough. They're mostly Southern kids. There was only like 3 kids on this list from the Midwest. Mm-hmm. They pretty much just do it in the. So it's not as Notre Dame friendly as I would like. There are a few California kids, Jet White, a few others that might be possibilities. But for the most part, the linebacker out of Omaha is going to visit. Get his name. He's a pretty darn good player.
Ryan will have Ryan's got an article saved right now. That's Christian Jones. He's got an article that I'll be publishing here. I'm going to proof it and publish it here when we get out of this show. But yeah, he's another kid, and high school teammate of Teddy Rizak. By the way,
he mentioned that. This is one of the greatest quotes I laughed because I hated those mid-90s Nebraska teams. His dad played on that 96 team. And I'm thinking, well, Notre Dame's got no shot.
The one team that didn't win a title during that stretch.
Well, I mean, it's crazy. They were really good. But, anyway, the point is this. His dad's – so he's a Nebraska guy, right? He mentions it's Nebraska and it's, I believe, Iowa or somebody like that in Notre Dame. And I said, well, I assume you probably want to go to Nebraska. You're a fan. He goes, well, I'm kind of a fan, but they've never been any good when I was alive anyway. And I was like, wow. Like, I could just see his dad rolling his eyes, but there's nothing he can say to combat it. Right. Like, it's amazing how long it's been. since Nebraska was even. I mean,
right.
when was
like
the last time they
Nebraska's
were a
actually
top
won
10 team?
titles more recently than Notre Dame, but they've had
They
so
have
many more
fallen off.
down years
Oh
compared
my
to where
God.
Notre Dame has in recent years. Yeah.
It's unbelievable. But they're not going to.
Two guys I want you to talk about, Brian, too, is Ousmane Kroma and then Bryce Davis, because I know you talked to both of those guys, too.
Bryce Davis is a defensive lineman from just outside the Tri-Cities area near Duke, North Carolina, and NC State. I had no idea that Notre Dame was involved with him. I was just interviewing everybody that walked into this meeting room where all the kids came in. It's just a scrum. Everybody talks to him. And he says, yeah, Notre Dame, really want to visit Notre Dame. And I'm like, oh, I had no idea. For whatever reason, and you've talked about this on the show about 500 times, Al Washington connects with certain kids and other kids not at all. I have whatever it is. And right before the evening workout, I'd interviewed him the day before. The evening workout the next day, they're doing 7-on-7 and stuff. And I go underneath the state. It's super hot. It's horrible down here right now. I go underneath the stadium before they come out, and two people come in there. It happened to be his parents. And I'm talking to him, and his mom's all about learning about Notre Dame and some of these schools out of state. Dad just wants him to stay closer to home because he's tired of spending all this money on travel, but that's another story. But he's like,
you explained to me, Notre Dame has 3 road games in North Carolina next year. So,
I know. It's pretty bizarre, by the way. That is hilarious, by the way.
Yeah. And the Carolinas, Carolinas, 2 in North Carolina, 1 in South Carolina.
But Notre Dame has a really good shot at him, and he's a kid they selected at the halftime of the 7-on-7. They did a handful of 1-on-1s with D linemen and O line, and I'm talking about humongous human beings. And he held his own. He's one of the top guys in the country as a pass rusher. That never goes out of style. He's a big end long term for me, is my guess.
Because he's already 6'4", 230 already.
Yeah, he's actually a little bigger than that now.
So and he's ranked in the top 50 by 247 Sports and Rivals.
And he's a great kid.
Yeah,
he could fit in at Notre Dame. Before anybody asks, I didn't even ask him his GPA. I know he's good.
Yeah,
he's articulate. He's very polite. He fits Notre Dame, like Wake Forest, Duke, Notre Dame, Vandy. He'd be fine. Now, if you really look at the other kid, this was bizarre to me because he's from Central Georgia. I don't even know how do you pronounce his name. Great kid, running back. But when I saw him going through the drills of running back, we're all sitting there watching, like, hey, he's a little stiff. But you can just tell this muscle on muscle, just popping out of his body. And then they started doing some routes on air, and they had him running corner routes and stuff. And he was coming right at me. And I'm like, holy cow. He's catching the ball over his shoulder and everything. Then I saw why he had all the offers. When I asked him about Notre Dame and all the schools that were recruiting him, Notre Dame, he's got a great relationship with Dawan McCullough.
Shocker.
I know that. I mean, do I think they'll get him? No, because Notre Dame's depth chart is just insane. But so is Georgia's. So is that. Like all the schools he's looking at, it's the same deal. And before anybody asked, articulate kid, won't have any problems academically, but he is not a typical Central Georgia kid. Distance will have zero impact on him. Most kids from that area, distance from mom is number 1 on the board. He could care less. He's just going to go do his own thing. If he went to Stanford, wouldn't surprise me. He's going to do his own thing. Great kid. And he is the kind of guy that you make a business decision with if you're going to tackle him on an inside zone. So that kind of denotes what kind of player he is. Again, muscles popping off muscles. He's not lacking in that testosterone area.
All right, let's get to the next one here from Jordan Schreiber. Which freshman defensive lineman do you think gets the most playing time and makes the biggest impact this year? So I'll give you a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look at one of the questions I answered in that football chat we're doing it. And my bold prediction, if I had to pick a guy, which freshman do I think will be that breakout guy? I'm either going with Armel Mukum or Boubacar Traore are the two I'm going with. And as long as he stays healthy, I'm probably going with Boubacar. I just think his combination of size and power, but it would not shock me if any of those 3 guys do it. So I'm just gonna have a little bit of fun with it, Brian, and just predict that Boubacar's the guy that breaks out. Because I feel like Boubacar's just such a raw kid. So like I had him near the bottom of my list of my ranking of my defensive class last year in my current grade because he hasn't played a lot of football. He was injured for a chunk of his senior year. There's just not a lot you see of him. But he was, I think, number 1 on my upside list. Because he may not know what he's doing right now, but that has a ton of ability. And he's the kind of kid, Brian, that just shows up at college, gets like a good summer of coaching, and all of a sudden the light goes on in like week 3, and you're like, okay, this kid was down on our scout team just murdering our starting offensive line. So we're going to go ahead and bring him up, and then by the middle of the year, he's in your rotation. Like I could see something like that happening.
Well, if there's a kid that can do it, he can't. He just needs to stay healthy, number one. I mean, that's always a concern. Your most valuable asset is how much you're able to play. I love Muko. I mean, I just think that his tools, long-term, he could be the best guy out of the group. I fully understand that short-term, that's going to be hard. I hope he gets to play a little bit this year, even if it's just 3 or 4 games. The guy that I actually think that could make some impact this year is Vernon, just because of his size. Again, I'm not picking on Cross, but he's not a natural nose guard in terms of 3rd and 1. They're going to try different guys. And Vernon may not be able to handle much of it, but 5-10 snaps a game, he might be a guy that comes in and is a goal line short yardage guy. Who knows?
Because I think he's going to be about 265. He's going to show up at around 260, 265.
Oh, is he down that much?
Yeah,
I thought he was like at 290 at one point.
He lost a bunch of weight after his senior year because he got put on too much weight, or like too much weight fast, and he got a little slow. And so when he showed
totally up, shifting. Then.
So Notre Dame wanted that. They wanted him to drop some weight so they can put it back on the right way. So they can put it on.
Well, I don't know where he's going to play at then. I mean, he could play 3 spots depending on the situation and formation.
Yeah. I think he'll start as a big end, and then depending on how he takes to the strength and conditioning program and the nutrition program, I could see him moving inside at some point in time. Yeah. But because he was like 290 during the senior season, Brian.
That's what I thought he was. That's what I thought.
But I think Ryan said at the Army game that he covered, he said Brennan looked like a completely different kid. I mean, he had lost a bunch of weight and was like sitting there with his thing tucked up. And most defensive linemen, I'm like, bro, put your shirt down. But he didn't look. I mean, I didn't like it because I think it's just weird when linemen do that. Period. But I was like, oh, okay, he looked like it wasn't an abnormal thing. He had some much better weight. And when I saw him arrive for summer workouts, he looked like he'd kind of maintained that winter look. So I think, and that's something Notre Dame wanted because the weight he put on was calorie weight. You know what I mean? It wasn't
pizza, pasta.
Yeah. Just trying to get his weight up on his own as opposed to, dude, just be what you are. And then we'll get that weight on the right way when you get here. So he got a lot of that off, which is good. Next question is from Rob Osgood. Guys, you were the defensive coordinator. What players along the line would you play versus Navy and Ohio State? Run teams versus more pro-style teams? What would your D-line plan be? Thanks again. Brian, I don't know that I would change my players a whole lot, to be honest with you. I think I would just kind of maybe change where I'd line them up a little bit. I'd maybe put a 5th defensive lineman on the field at times, maybe in certain looks. But I really think one of the mistakes some people make when they play Navy is they completely change their personnel.
That's dangerous.
Yeah, it's like play the guys you have. Just make sure the scheme is geared towards stopping them. So I don't know that I would change a whole lot about that. I think the only thing I would consider changing is what I may do is against Navy is play less of Javonte Jean-Baptiste as that really long edge guy, and maybe move Riley Mills out there and put Gabriel Rubio and Jason Onye and Howard Cross into sort of a 3-man rotation in the 2 inside spots, and just really dominate them at the point of attack with size and power and quickness.
I would imagine Cross, depending on how you used him, his first step is amazing.
Yeah.
He should have multiple tackles for loss.
Yeah.
Against Navy or any option team. That would be my guy for pick to click.
Yeah. And Ohio State, again, the personnel doesn't change, Rob. It's the how you implement that personnel, to me, that would change. If I'm changing and now I'm keep in mind, I'm just talking about the defensive line. I would change personnel on the 2nd and 3rd levels, because if you're a 4-2-5 team, you shouldn't stay in a 4-2-5 with a nickel back on the field when you're playing Navy. I mean, you put another linebacker on the field. What I was referring to is the defensive line, just so that we're clear on that. That's just and if I was going to go to a 4-2-5, my nickel would be a more of a pure safety, so I can get him in that 2nd level and let him attack the options and have someone that can kind of peel on the wheels, tack downhill, peel with a wheel route, things like that. Those I would make some changes there, but from a front standpoint, that's when I'm talking about not changing personnel. That's where I think teams get in trouble, is when they make big adjustments to who they play in the front 7. I'm not changing that. Yeah, I've only seen that really work once, and that was with Greer Martini. And that was the darndest thing. He just for whatever reason just knew how to play the triple option. He was really good at it. Next question is from Salty Virginia Peanuts. Smitty, you attended an Austin Westlake game last season to see the great one in person. Do you think he will start this year, and how do you think he will perform? Keep in mind that this is the biggest Jaden Greathouse fanboy on the face of the planet, and he will tell you that. So when he says the great one, he's referring to Jaden Greathouse.
Do I think he will start? No. Do I think he will be in consistent rotation at slot and at times possibly playing starter minutes? Depends on the team they're playing. But, I mean, they have a speedy running back that's transitioned. And when I say speed, I mean he's 4.3. It's hard to take him off the field, bro. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was watching the Clemson game last night. There was a little pass out in the flat, and, I mean, it was like 3 yards. And he was even with the linebacker. 3 steps later, it looked like they weren't on the same field. It's hard to take those guys off the field because, again, there was no effort in the play. It was just schemed well, very generic. It was a nice pass. But for me to the wall that's 15 feet away, and then he got 10 yards out of it. Jaden is a take-it-off-your-head route runner, power guy. Could probably help you in the screen game, block and stuff better. But they're not going to just put him out there to start right away. Now, is he going to start as a sophomore and junior? Yeah. Do I think he'll turn pro after 3 years? Probably. Because he's such a good all-around player. But I would go. What do you think, Brian? 25 catches this year, give or take?
Minimum. Yeah. Here's the thing, Brian. If he was here last year, he starts.
I know that's what's funny, but they moved a 4.3 guy to slot.
Right. Well, Jaden Thomas is such a better player this year than he was beginning of last year. Tobias is in year 2. I mean,
the difference in last year to this at one position in major college football. Yeah. Wide receiver at Notre Dame might be number 1. Yeah. Literally.
Yeah. That and Iowa at quarterback are the two.
I could go find a random guy on the street here in Bartow, Florida. Okay? Some guy that's never played football. He could throw it better than I was. Yeah. That guy was terrible.
Oh, it was really bad. Really bad. Jeez. Yeah, really, really bad. All right, let's get to the next one here. Jordan Schreiber, do you think Tim Brown will make a big impact mentoring Tobias Merriweather? To a degree, sure. I mean, my understanding is, this is something that was from an interview at the golf outing or something along those lines, but they're going to have him around Tobias Merriweather. Look, Tim Brown can absolutely impart some wisdom on Tobias Merriweather, but the biggest impact for Tobias is going to be, number 1, Tobias just having that inner desire to be great. Does he have it or not? That's a question with every player that's a talented player. Do you have that deep burning desire to be great? And are you in a position where losing is, you have to ask yourself, because I feel like this is a debate you have with all great players, like true champions. What drives you more? Your love for winning or your hatred for losing? And to me, when you have guys that can have sort of that inner desire to just be like, I want to dominate, I want to be great, and I'm going to do whatever I got to do to get there. That's the question. And I don't care if it's Tim Brown mentoring him or who, it doesn't matter. That's going to be on Tobias. And then, of course, the work with Coach Stuckey. And it's what it's going to come down to. Now, is it good to have people like Tim Brown in your ear giving you some pointers and some motivation and some tips? Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no downside to that. But I don't think we're going to look back and be like, wow, if you don't have that whatever time you have with Tim Brown, Tobias doesn't have the breakout that he's going to have. It's just a piece to the puzzle of getting Tobias to play to his potential, in my opinion. Next question is from Sean Green. Outside of just stats, what are some key areas of their game or techniques you want to see this season to let you know players are being developed? And we'll look at the defensive line for this question, Brian. So what are some areas outside of just stats? What are some key areas? Because I think that's a good preface, because sometimes stats are a byproduct of you're just better than the dude across from you, not necessarily that you're being developed. So I like that preface. What are some key areas of their game or techniques that you want to see this season to let you know that the defensive linemen, we'll go with defensive linemen, are being developed?
I think the biggest one is what you talked about earlier. Some guys got to get away with basic talent. Burnham's like, he's going to run around a few guys this year. That's great. Does he have a counter move to a rip? Does he have a counter move to a swim? All the little things, because once he gets toolsy with that length and that's a 10 sack guy. Now, he's not going to get reps to get 10 sacks this year, but we're still going to see it in small doses. Jordan Botelho has been a dip and go guy, not necessarily had the most moves, but you're not going to out hustle him. If he adds just a few little things, and I don't know what, everybody's got their own comfort zone with all these different pass rush moves. If he adds just two more, he's looking at 8 sacks this year. Same thing with Riley Mills, etc. It's just technique stuff. I know that's a boring answer, but it really looks good at the stat line at the end of the year.
Yeah, using hands better, driving feet through contact. I think the other thing too, Brian, is Jordan was really good at that getting under, but not a lot of the other ends were good at that. That's something that I want to see. That's something that Jordan brought with him from Hawaii. If you go back and watch his high school film, he got taught that in high school. I like to see more of that from the Notre Dame defensive line.
Foskey never really consistently did. They drove me nuts.
Yeah. Foskey reminds me, Brian, you remember that old Sinbad skit back in the day? I think it was Afros and Bell Bottoms, that comedy skit he did. We talked about like that OG, right, that he was at the club. He had that one move, but he's still doing it. I mean, it's just –
That's right.
Right? That was Isaiah Foskey. He just had that one move. That was really it, and so
he's a
you'd like to
guy.
see a little bit more of an advanced repertoire, a little bit from the defensive line this year.
I want to see Botelho have a counter to that dip, like some kind of back under move or something like that. Then he gets the guy thinking, and then like the entire second half, he's got him on skates. Once Notre Dame gets guys doing that, it's over with. I thought Florida State's D linemen in the 90s were the best at counter moves. And my God, it was just insane. I don't think there's going to be too many teams that can get the sack totals that happened back then because football's changed. But Notre Dame, again, with a little bit of advancement, basic stuff like using hands and stuff anyway, just with moves, 40 sacks is like the bottom end of where they should be as a unit. Now, part of that, like Brian talked about earlier, Bertrand and some of those guys will get some easy sacks coming up in the pocket when the guy moves. I don't care who gets it, but it's a collective effort. And that's how you get there, man, because you're going to play against some good players. We can't have one sack against Ohio State this year.
Right.
I will lose my mind if that is the answer.
Right.
Especially
and I get where you're coming from, Brian, and I think you're going to agree with this. The problem wasn't just the number of sacks, because I don't think C.J. Stroud's necessarily super easy guy to sack. Like Caleb Williams is not a really easy guy to sack. The problem was there wasn't enough. Like C.J. Stroud was only sacked 12 times last year. It was more of a. I mean, you could get 2 sacks, 3 sacks, and not be overly disruptive through the course of the game. There has to be a consistent level of disruption. And it may only result in a sack or 2, but does it result in more pass breakups, more interceptions, more tip balls, more negative plays? That's the question, because the sack numbers were good last year for Notre Dame, right? Like 38. They were like I said, they were 13th in college football last year, and all that stuff is good, but I still felt like they allowed completions at a too high of a rate, in my opinion, at certain positions. And so those are areas that I want to see them continue to get better, because a team that ranks 13th in sacks should not rank 45th in completion percentages allowed, and should not rank 129th in pass breakups. There were so many weird stats.
They did have an odd combo, didn't they? They really
Notre
did.
Dame last year. Like a team that's 13th in sacks normally is going to be a team that's high in turnovers, high in pass disruptions, and that kind of stuff. And it was just really weird. And it goes back to what I said was there was a lot of hollow stats last year from the D-line, where it was like late in game sacks. Like they had a lot of late sacks against Cal. But the inability to make stops early, it kind of put you in a position to kind of be there. Of course, what also helped was the game be close, as the offense played like garbage really until late in the game as well. But there just were, like, this, Brian, you'll see guys that produce and you're just like, yeah, I know this guy had 9 sacks last year, but he really wasn't that good, because he had a lot of garbage sacks. He had a lot of not important sacks. He had 3 sacks where like just nobody touched him in the third quarter, something like that. And that's going to be the big thing for me. Is I'm a big believer that sacks can be an overrated statistic if you're not looking at them within context. And I know you look at them in context, Brian, but it can be that way where if you just have 1 or 2 sacks and you've got 15, 16, 17 pressures you did your job because it resulted
That
in
could actually be work because you can get picks and
Right.
big plays. Yeah.
Right. Or you have 3 sacks and 7 total pressures. And 2 of your sacks were like, on third down. Another one was like right before the end of the half or something like that. Guys scrambling around, no one's open, and he just kind of goes down and you sack him. That you're not impactful in that situation. So to me, to your point, they need to be more disruptive against Ohio State because that's the thing is that's going to be the first really big game for whoever their starting quarterback is. Right. And so your Notre Dame's quarter. Look, when you're playing a team like Ohio State, and I've said this, Brian, I believe Ohio State could end up being better this year than they were last year as a team, and their record not reflect it. Because I think their schedule's tougher this year. They got to play at Michigan. They got to play at Notre Dame. I think Penn State's going to be better this year. And the reason I say that is because there's one position I'm concerned about with Ohio State, and that's quarterback. And it's not – the numbers are going to be fine. But it comes down to, but can you be money? Like CJ Stroud did not play great against Notre Dame last year. He didn't. Go look at the numbers. He didn't. But you know what he was against Notre Dame, Brian? Money.
100%.
He made game-winning plays. When he did hit throws, they were money throws. So you look at it this year, and to my guy Archer, with all due respect to Indiana, they play Indiana, Youngstown State, and Western Michigan or Western Kentucky in the first 3 games. That's a whole different animal than playing Notre Dame. It just is, right? So, and I know that Kyle McCord has a career start. I think it was like against Akron 2 years ago, right? This is a different animal.
I'm not sold on him either.
Right. Now, I like Kyle McCord, but again, it comes down to that's a different animal than going on the road to play Ohio State, right? And what's the mental part going to be like? But here's the thing that can happen. If Kyle McCord comes into Notre Dame Stadium and he's able to get time to throw and get into an early rhythm, he will have success. He will rip Notre Dame up because the receivers are phenomenal, the running backs are outstanding, and the scheme is going to be really good. The way to win that game, the way to beat him, the way to be disruptive, or the way to keep him from being effective and to win that game is never let him get comfortable. Because CJ Stroud you could do that to CJ and he could still make you pay for it. Because he was a top 5 overall draft pick talent, and he had a whole year of starting under his belt. Kyle McCord won't have that. And to your point, Brian, you could sack him 3 times and still not be disruptive against him. But if he's getting harassed play after play, when he does have a clean pocket, you're getting your hands up and you're knocking it down, things like that. You're hitting him as soon as he's throwing it. You're forcing him to rush throws and get throws out there quickly. And yeah, he may complete a ball, but you're tackling Marvin Harrison for 3 yards because he had to get the ball out so quick. Like, that's how you beat Ohio State. If it comes down to my corner's got to cover Marvin Harrison for an entire route, guess what? I don't care how good Notre Dame's corners are. They're going to get beat because that's how good he is, right? And that's true for most receivers versus corners. If you have to cover me longer than 3.5, 4 seconds, I'm going to beat you, right?
Yeah,
it's just the reality of it.
4 seconds for people out there. If you're covering for more than 4,
it's
Deion
toast.
didn't cover well after 4.
It's toast.
It's too hard.
Exactly. So if I have to force Kyle McCord to get the ball out quickly, and that may result, the way the Ohio State runs their offense, that may not result in a lot of sacks, but higher incompletions, that's going to be the key. Because Notre Dame only had 1 sack last year against Ohio State. That's not actually the number that bothered me. The number that bothered me against Ohio State last year is the fact that, they just, to me, didn't force enough negatives. I mean, he only averaged 6.6 yards per attempt, but he completed 70.6% of right. But he completed 70.6% of his throws. Right.
You want to dunk them to death.
Exactly. And then that allowed their run game to take it over because they knew that Notre Dame's offense wasn't a threat. That's what it came down to. They didn't have to once they took the lead, they didn't have to take shots.
They took no chances, even
because they
quarterback.
They were not going to let the defensive line or the secondary, which had actually covered pretty well that game, force an interception or give them a short field. They just knew that they weren't going to give up points. This year, if Notre Dame is coming out scoring offensively, Ohio State's going to take more shots. They're going to take more chances. They're going to throw the ball down the field. And
they know
that was Marvin Harrison's second career start. Right. So you now know more of what you have in him. They thought he was going to be really good, but now he's really good. Right now, Notre Dame has really good corners too. But again, I don't care how good you are. If Marvin Harrison's able to completely, fully execute his post route, and the quarterback's able to make a clean throw, there's a good chance, unless you have safety help, that's going to be a completion more than you'd hope it would be. But if the quarterback's getting hit before he's even getting out of the top of his post route, guess what? That ball's getting chucked down to somebody else. It's getting dropped off to somebody else, or it's an errant throw that you then can force an incompletion or make a pick off of, right? That's what it comes down to, Brian. And it all comes down to, can your defensive line be disruptive consistently? And to Brian's point, to circle it all back around, if you've got one move, eventually a team coached by Justin Fry is going to figure that out.
Yeah.
And they're going to have you so you may have a lot of success in the first half. They're going to go in there, they're going to make their adjustments, come out in the second half and say, okay, we know that this is the move that this guy has. So we're just going to have our left tackle just a little overset, just a little. So so if Jordan Botelho is just consistently getting around you, and that's all he has, that little dip and rip around the edge. Okay, that's fine. It's going to open up that outside pass set just a little bit, drop that back foot just a little bit more, and then allow him to get a little bit better angle. So we'll maybe do just a little bit more of a vertical set so we can meet him, a little small adjustment, and then bam, we got him stopped. Now, if they're coached well, when Ohio State makes that adjustment, Notre Dame sees that immediately in the next snap. They come off and he starts on a vertical angle. As soon as that guy oversets, boom, I'm beating him inside on a counter move, and I'm to the quarterback again.
There we go.
That's the difference between a well-coached team and a team that just does the basics.
And that's
right?
the team that doesn't make it to the playoffs and does.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Good questions. We have some great questions today so far. You guys are on fire. Really good job.
Yeah.
Andre Tonsel says, can Notre Dame go 3 deep across the O-line? Just a little worried. Go Irish breakdown, go. 3 deep? No.
No team goes 3 deep, bro.
Yeah. Now, can they go 3 deep in numbers? Yes, they can go 3 deep in numbers. They actually have more than 15 guys, numbers-wise. I think they're like 18. But as far as 3 deep of guys ready to play, no, I don't think so. Because and really what it comes down to, Brian, is I actually think in some positions they can go 3 deep in the offensive line and the interior. Because you have Zeke Krell at center, and then Pat Coogan is a veteran player, but the Notre Dame staff loves Ashton Craig. Now,
really?
whether he's they love Harry loved him and Coach Rudolph loved him. Like they love Ashton Craig. Now, will he be ready to seize a number 2 job this year or more next spring? That still remains to be seen because he's still building his body back up. But he's already almost 300 pounds now. Like they love Ashton Craig. So center, I think you can go 3 deep, especially if Ashton Craig passes up Pat Coogan, and Pat Coogan's now the 3rd guy. They're 3 deep there. Right guard, you've got Andrew Kristofic, you've got Rocco Spindler, and you've got Billy Schrouth, and let's say Michael Carmody. Well, then you've got like Charles Jagasaw and Sam Pendleton and some younger players like that. Maybe Ty Chan. So you can go 3 deep there. The question for me, the problem that I have, I don't know that you can go 3 deep at tackle. That's the bigger question for me.
Where do you think they're going to start Jagasaw at? Guard or tackle, or is that just completely unknown?
I think they'll start him at tackle and kind of see early on how the interior guys are playing. And then also maybe take some of the pressure off Charles. But I do believe, Brian, it would not shock me if after the first couple weeks of fall camp that if they're looking at the guard and they're just like, man, I don't know if these guys are the answer, that they could then
throw him in there.
Inside. Yeah.
Because athletically, he's good enough to start as a freshman.
Yeah.
He's
I think him moving the guard would require the other guards not to be playing well. Now, if Notre Dame's depth chart was as healthy as it needs to be at tackle, then I think you'd be more prone to just move him there. But right now, if Blake, I don't think both Blake Fisher and Joe Alt go pro after this year. I would argue, and most people will disagree with me on this, I would argue there's a better chance they both come back than they both leave. I don't think either one of those things happens. I think Joe Alt goes, and I think Blake Fisher stays. And I think the selling point to Notre Dame is next year you're going to move to left tackle. But then you go into 2024, and you've got Blake Fisher, Tosh Baker, and Emil Wagner at tackle. That's really it. Ty Chan's playing there now. He's not a tackle. He needs to move inside. Is Sullivan Absher tackle? I don't know. So you got to look at it and say, number one, we need to improve our talent at tackle, our depth at tackle. But number two, if I'm wrong, and there's a chance I could be wrong, and if Blake, because I did my breakout show yesterday, and I talked about Blake. If Blake breaks out and Joe Alt just does what Joe Alt does, it's not out of the realm of possibility that two of the 4 tackles first off the board in next year's draft for those 2 kids, right? It's not out of the realm of possibility. I still think Blake Fisher's a year away from being a first-round draft pick. I think he's more of a comeback for your senior year, and then you're a top 15 pick. But if he makes the jump a year sooner, Brian, it's not out of the realm of possibility. And then if you get into that situation, and now you've got to transition Charles Jagasaw back out to tackle, I don't know if that's where you want to be, ideally. So unless you think we need to put him in the starting lineup, I think you need to develop him at tackle. I really do, because I think he could be a star there too. And then if you go into 2024 and Blake Fisher moves to left tackle, now Charles and Tosh Baker and Emil Wagner are battling for that second tackle spot. And if you, in the worst case scenario for Notre Dame, well, worst case for 24 would be a great scenario for 23 because it means they both played like All-Americans. But if Blake and Joe both leave, now you've got Jagasaw, Baker, and Emil battling for 2 starting jobs, as opposed to just Tosh and Emil at tackle. And then after that, what do you got? So I just think the potential of someday having a battle of Jagasaw and Emil and Gearby Lambert, if you're able to get him, is kind of ideally where you want to be. And then if you're like, Emil's great, Gearby's great, Charles is great, one of them's going to move to guard and be a starter at guard.
That way you get all 3 on the football
right. Then you do it.
It'll take care of itself. Sure.
Yeah. But right now, I would need to know that he's definitely. I'm not leaving him as the backup tackle, Brian, if he's my best guard, right guard. I'm just not. But I would need to not
play him and then move him later.
Exactly. I'd have to not feel good about my other guards at right guard before I would move him.
That's what Alabama has done with some of their young studs. They start them at guard and they move them around until they play left tackle.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Next question is from Jordan Schreiber. When is Smitty starting his recruiting show, and why is he focusing on the Southeast? Didn't he move to Texas? So I'll let you answer those, Brian.
The Southeast, number one, just has the most players, and it's not even in the same stratosphere with any other area. And I moved Texas, moved right back to Florida. So I'm talking to some different people about it just to put it in perspective. I've made friends all over the South. I've got a buddy that I can rely on in Central Louisiana. I've got a few that are around the Atlanta area, camps, different things, different coaches I can stay. So I might do a show with Driscoll one day and I'm in Florida. 2 days later, Driscoll doesn't even know it. I'm in Arkansas or I'm in Alabama doing the show at some freaking cafe.
Oh, that's true. I'll call Brian, like, hey man, what's going on? He's like, oh, I'm just on the highway in East Texas. I'm like, what are you doing? Yeah, I'm just heading out over to see such and such. The other thing too, Brian, is you and I we also talked about this. The state of recruiting show still exists. There will be times when Brian and I or Ryan and Brian do a show at CFP Nation that is a more national show.
100%.
But the regular show that Brian is going to do is going to be the Southeastern show.
Yeah.
But we will have, like we may say, hey, like, look, we're going to break down the top West Coast kids today. And it'd be more of that stadium recruiting thing. It'll still be Brian, but it won't be that regular show. It'll just be us saying, hey, let's talk about, like, I think like one of the topics we discussed was like, there's these great battles going on between USC and Oregon. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about, we may do a show here this summer. And actually, Brian, this is actually a really good idea I'd like to do, is some recruiting classes that maybe aren't getting the love that some others are that I really like. And
that is Ryan, a show we can do year round.
Yeah. Ryan and I were chatting about this the other day and just looking at some of the classes that we really like. Like, Penn State's ranked kind of high for rivals. They're ranked 6th, but you don't hear them talked about a whole lot. As far
class is freaking good, man.
They're not even done yet. I think they got a shot with Chris Cole. I think they got a shot with Malachi Williams. Like, they're not even done yet. They're doing a really nice job. And I'll tell you who's really putting together a quiet, good class, especially on offense, is Stanford. Stanford's doing some really nice
in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Man. I did not see that comment at all.
Part of it is they have 26 kids committed, right?
Well, that's because their roster is in
right.
dire straits.
But they're doing some nice things. North Carolina's putting a nice class together. Clemson's class isn't ranked very high because they don't have a lot of kids, but they're landing some really good football players. So, we'll have some shows like that, but that'll be more of that state of the recruiting type of stuff that we'll do together. But the regular show, and part of it that is, so what does the regular show mean? It means there's going to be consistent publish dates for that. So, like, we're going to publish it. I think, what would we say, Brian? You're going to have something that goes out
Monday, Thursdays. I'm hoping it's kind of the tentative
plan. Yeah. Like, I think we'll publish them Mondays. I think the other one was Thursday or Friday, and then during the season he'll also have a
Saturday morning show
that he'll publish from the night before. And like we've had some fun, like and I don't know if it'll be for this year or next, but like we're going to start a CFP Nation Instagram page. So, and Brian will kind of have his from the road stuff. So one of the shows he'll do during the season, this is going to be more for the YouTube channel, is a road show. So like, on the Instagram page, like we'll find like a really cool little local restaurant at every high school he's going to. And, talk about that, do stuff from the sideline. Hey, I'm at the sideline, so-and-so, just a couple of quick takeaways. So we'll do a lot of stuff like that. That'll be on the YouTube channel. But the regular breakdowns for the podcast channel are going to be, as of right now, I think Monday and Thursday, or Monday and Friday. I forget. I can't remember if we said the recording day was going to be Thursday and the published day was going to be Friday, but we'll get all figured out. But there will be consistency where the show gets published at this time. And then eventually we'll get to have some live shows and things like that as well. So we have a lot planned, Jordan, no doubt. But you guys know me. I want to start with a focus and then build on top of that. And the way to start with this is to have that Southeastern focus. And eventually we'll grow to where we do talk about more things. And that'll be a lot of fun. Next question from John A1. Since you've been covering Notre Dame, how do you feel about this 23 team's chances to win a title compared to past years? Oh, boy. I mean, that's a great question, John. Look, at this time,
change.
Yeah. I mean, I think because like some of the best teams Notre Dame had, I didn't know that they were going to be that kind of team going into that year. Like I didn't know that the 2017 team was going to be as good as it was. I thought they were going to be better, but I didn't anticipate that they were going to go out and run for 300 plus yards in 7 of the first 8 games and run for 500 against a BC team that had 2 high draft picks on their defensive line. And then there's other teams I thought were going to be really good that just weren't as good as they. And then other years I thought the 2018 team was going to be pretty good, and they were pretty good. So it just depends. I would say this is probably, since I started really covering the team back in like 2007, this is probably in my top 4 teams that I'm most excited about going into the season. But Brian, it's not just because of how good Notre Dame is. Look, this is a big thing. Like, you have to also look at what you're going up against. And the part of the thing for me about Notre Dame is the fact that some of the top teams, I don't anticipate them being as good as they have been in recent years. Now, they're still going to be very good, and Georgia's still a championship caliber team. Bama's a championship caliber team. Clemson's a championship caliber team. Ohio State's a championship caliber team. Michigan's a playoff caliber team. Right? Those teams are still really good. But I feel like they were here in the past, and now they're kind of here. And Notre Dame's kind of coming up. It's why I thought the 2015 Notre Dame team had a shot to win a championship, because there was no other great team. That Bama team in 15 wasn't as good as their 2012 team or their 2020 team to me. 17 was another example to where, Notre Dame took the national championship runners-up down to the wire. Notre Dame twice had the ball in the fourth quarter with a chance to win that game against Georgia in 2017. And then Georgia took Bama over. That was not a great Bama team. Notre Dame could have won it that year, but I wouldn't have known. I didn't know that going into the season, right? That's more hindsight 2020. I didn't know that going into the season. I thought the 2015 team had a chance to be special because they were just so talented. And this team reminds me of that team more than any other. There was a lot of question marks. There's some coaching question marks. And the question marks on coaching on this team are not nearly as great as they were on that team. But there just was a lot of talent. And the question was, okay, is this talent going to step up and play to its potential? Does Malik break out and build on the bowl game performance he had? Does Torian Folson break out? Is CJ Prosise going to be able to make that transition to running back and be a difference maker? And there's questions like who steps up alongside, Will Fuller that season? Because I believe, like when you looked at that, the receiving core, you had Corey Robinson on that team, you had Chris Brown, you had Amir Carlisle, you had some guys, but the question was, would they really be able to take it to that next level and really support him the way that you expected? And those were all question marks, but the talent was there. You thought the offensive line was going to be good, right? There just was this expectation that the offensive line was going to be really good. I didn't know what Quentin Nelson was going to be, but you thought he was going to be pretty good, right? You kind of feel, I'm not saying Billy Schrouth is going to be as good as what Quentin Nelson was, but I have a similar vibe about Billy Schrouth that I had about Quentin at the time. I didn't think Quentin Nelson was going to be the best interior offensive lineman Notre Dame was going to have in 30 years going into 2015. I didn't see that. I thought he was going to be really good, but I didn't see that. So I feel like Billy Schrout is where I thought Quentin was then. He's going to step in, make a smooth transition, and be pretty good. He'll have some freshman moments, but it'll be pretty good. That's what I think the Schrout will be. So, Brian, there's a lot. Defensive line-wise, there was more veterans there, but they didn't have the depth. I love the depth more here. So there's just a lot to be excited about with this team, but they need some breaks to happen. They need a couple guys to play better than you think they're going to play. They need to have some good luck with health, and that's just kind of where I'm at when I look at this team compared to some past teams. So probably top 4 for me.
There's one added thing. You and I talk about this. Every other year it kind of goes this way. Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia. They all are great teams, but they don't have experienced quarterbacks coming back. That is humongous. It's not fun playing Alabama. It's really not fun when he's got Bryce Young.
Or Mac Jones is a senior.
That's what I mean. You can't have an experienced guy at quarterback, and then, oh, by the way, he's got 3 guys getting ready to be drafted at receiver.
Brian, you don't have to beat Trevor Lawrence or Deshaun Watson. No. I love Cade Klubnik. I think you do too. We're both high on him.
But he's still going to be a first-year starter.
And he's still not Trevor Lawrence.
Trevor Lawrence
he'll
is a
never be
once-in-a-lifetime
Trevor.
player. Yeah.
He's not Deshaun Watson. He's just not. He's very good, but to your point, he's not Deshaun. He's not Trevor.
Yep.
And neither is anybody on Alabama's roster. There's no Tua on Alabama's roster, in my opinion. There just isn't. There isn't. There's no Joe Burrow at LSU or Clemson.
It's a really weird quarterback year in college football, to be honest.
Because the best
certain guy in Chapel Hill in LA,
right? But they're not on those typical power teams. The best quarterbacks in college football this year are on teams that aren't typical, title contenders. Now, Caleb's good enough to make USC that a title contender. I mean, he just is, especially depending on part of it's going to be the matchup. What are the matchups they would get if they did get to the postseason? But that's the thing, is you've got to take advantage of that. So that's factor. Not only am I excited about Notre Dame, but there's those risks. And the other thing too, Brian, is one of the things that's hurt Notre Dame in the past is Brian Kelly was not a great prepare you for a bowl game coach.
Don't get me started.
They were much better at let me play that team after a week of preparation, right? And so to me, the fact that you could potentially knock out 2 perennial title contenders in the regular season is huge in this regard as well. You could potentially knock Ohio State out if you beat them. Now, and what I mean by that is this: if you get to the end of the season and you beat Ohio State and they're 12-1, you're 11-1, and there's 3 undefeated teams, there's a good chance Notre Dame gets in over Ohio State, right? Because they'd have another big win, and you get to all those type of things. They'd have a shot. And now Ohio State has to be perfect the rest of the year. They got to beat Penn State, they got to beat Michigan, they got to beat Iowa, Wisconsin, whoever they would play in the Big Ten title game. You have a good – you probably – look, if it comes down to it and Notre Dame is a one-loss team and Clemson's a one-loss team being in the ACC, Notre Dame's getting in over Clemson. So at least one of those teams, possibly 2, and depending on how the season goes, you could potentially knock out 3 teams that college football analysts project as title contenders. You could knock them out in the regular season.
That's hilarious. That's great.
Right. So now all of a sudden you've given yourself some favor. You don't have to beat Ohio State in the postseason now with a month of preparation. You don't have to beat Clemson. You do not want to play Dabo Swinney with a month for him to prepare when he has a good team. You just don't.
He's a good coach.
And, so those are the things that I look at when I look at how do I feel about this Notre Dame team. It's great. Brian, I'll tell you what, man, they are bringing the fire today with the questions today. You guys always do a great job with questions, but today you guys are really bringing it. Great question, John. Mr. 2.0, aside from what he's been asked to do in our scheme, what would be the ideal role for Howard Cross in any scheme?
Oof.
I think an ideal role for me is that you had a bigger nose guard as your starter.
And he's a 3-tech.
And he could play, he could slide between both. So let's say you had
the 2 situations.
Let's say Chris Smith was coming back and you were going to start Chris Smith at nose tackle, big 320-pound, just, And then all of a sudden the next, and that's what I thought made him and Howard Cross such a really good. Notre Dame was really good at nose tackle last year, underrated good at nose tackle last year with Chris Smith and Howard Cross, because you had two guys that could do different things. The problem is neither of them are great volume guys. Chris Smith was really good, but he can only give you about 20 snaps a game, right? Because he was a big kid. But let's say you had a Lewis Nix, and you could rotate Howard as your number 2 at nose and 3 technique, and maybe he only plays 10 snaps at nose, Brian, and his other 15 to 20 snaps come at 3 technique. That would be more of it. So my numbers for Howard wouldn't change a whole lot from a snap standpoint. Get him 30 to 35 a game, but they'd be split between the nose and the 3 technique. That would be the ideal role for me. And just so he keep him fresh, because when Howard Cross is fresh, he's hard to block. He's so quick off the line. He's just naturally low built.
3rd and 7, brother.
He dominates the leverage battle, Brian. Dominates the leverage battle consistently because of just
more power than he's given credit for.
Yeah. So. He's got some length too. We forget, we talk a lot about DNA and Bryce Young is Bryant Young. We forget Howard Cross's dad. He's got some NFL DNA in him as well.
Daddy could ball.
That's right. That's right. Next question is from Brian Van Gorder's burner. Other than CJ Carr, who is the best quarterback prospect? And I would assume we're talking about the 2024 class. Look,
that's rough, man.
Here's the thing. I'll tell you some guys I like. Number 1, and this is a very controversial topic. I know a lot of people don't agree with me on this, but I am not as high on Dylan Raiola as a lot of other people. Now, I get why people have him ranked number 1. I do. I get it. He has great physical tools. But I don't see a guy that processes really quickly. I don't see a guy that's consistently accurate. He'll go out in one session and look great, and then the next he won't. I was never blown away by his game film in regard to how it translates. He's a very good quarterback. Don't get me wrong, talent-wise. He's an elite quarterback talent-wise. I also think it's a bit of a red flag for me that he's about to be on his 3rd high school team in 4 years. Now, I know in this situation, the 3rd school is just getting into Georgia where he's going to play college ball. I get all that. But he also was already on 2 high school teams before this. And that's just a little bit of a red flag for me, Brian. So, but he's still very good. He's still very good. I like Air Noland a lot because, and here's why, Brian, he is going to the perfect system for what he does. Accurate, smart, quick decision maker. Good enough to get the ball down. He doesn't have a bazooka for an arm, but he can get the ball down the field. Like him and DJ Lagway are like completely polar opposite players. You know what I mean? Like
they are.
Where DJ just has his arm strength. I actually think DJ Lagway has the best pure arm strength in the class, even more than Dylan. I mean, it's
insane.
He
can throw off one
ridiculous.
way, side arm and stuff. It's crazy.
But Aaron Noland and CJ Carr are very similar players.
Yeah.
Like I think CJ's got a little bit more physical tools than Air does, but I think they're both smart. They're great processors. And in today's college football, those are the guys that are really great, are the guys that have it up here. Not necessarily guys that have the big arms, but they're not accurate and all this other kind of stuff. I like Air Noland a lot because of the fit. I think the fit is great. I'll tell you a guy that's really grown on me, Brian, is the kid going to Florida State. And I have no clue how to pronounce his last name. Croman Hoke or whatever. He's raw, but I love his physical tools. There's a lot of guys like that in this class, though, Brian. Guys that are just really toolsy, but just have a lot to learn. And I do like Julian Sayin a lot. I think he's a little overrated. I'll put it to you like this. If Julian Sayin would have picked Notre Dame and CJ Carr would have committed to Alabama, their rankings would be flipped, in my opinion. I love Julian Sayin, especially he's got some gunslinger to him. I just think him being a top 10 player is just too high. But he's easily a top 50 guy for me. I love Julian Sayin. I know he's impressive at Elite 11, but I like his high school film better. Like I said, he's got some Baker Mayfield to him, in my opinion. He's got that gunslinger mentality. He's more athletic than Baker is, though. That's the difference. So I really like Julian Sayin. A lot of the other guys in the class, Brian, are just toolsy guys that just need a lot of work. Like Colin Hurley can look great one instance, and then the next you're like, okay, this kid should have not reclassified. This kid should have stayed in the 25 class. He's
got one of the strongest. He can throw a football 60 miles an hour.
But there's just a lot of guys like that, though. Yeah. The toolsy guys that just need a ton of work. So that's a little bit of my concern with this class. But some of the guys that can, like the kid that I like that doesn't get talked a lot about is the other kid going to Georgia. Ryan Puglisi. I do. I'm with you, man. I honestly, I think it was a bit of a mistake for Georgia to make the move that they did. I really do. I think Puglisi's more of the kid that fits with what Georgia does on off. He's a leader. He can make plays with his legs, all that kind of stuff. He's not that big. I'm the name, I'm the brand, and all that.
I have a good backstory about him. Soon as Raiola committed, the other quarterback texted Kirby. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but he made it clear that he was sticking with Georgia and he was good with it.
Yeah.
He's a competitor. He's a competitor. That is a good sign. I would not be surprised if he ends up being Georgia's quarterback as a junior and the other kid is not there.
Yep. I'm with you. I'm glad you said that. I'm with you.
We're not the only ones. There are reasons around Raiola to believe he's boom or bust.
Yeah.
I mean, the arm strength and all the other stuff is Godzilla-like.
But there's just a lot of guys. Lagway's that way. Michael Hawkins going to Oklahoma's that way. There's physical tools there. They're just guys that need a lot of work, But
Carr has like the highest floor of anybody in air. I think Carr's slightly higher in air because he's got a better arm.
Yeah.
I know Air personally have for a couple of years. He'll do fine at Ohio State
because he's got it here, man. Like he is going to pick up. He's going to pick up Ryan Day's offense like that. I mean, he really
Air is really articulate. He threw for 5,000 yards or whatever. I was just something ridiculous. I forget what it was.
Yeah, and he doesn't look like physically. He doesn't look impressive, and you're just like, oh wow, that was a heck of a throw. Oh wow, because his anticipation is so good. Like his ability to process reads and get. I mean. In high school, you're watching him throw routes where guys are like hitting the top end of their route and the ball's coming out and it just throws it right to the perfect
100%.
spot. Like, I mean, him and CJ are really good when it comes to that kind of stuff. Really good.
I think both of them will get paid.
Yeah. And so they may not have the, wow, look at the big arm that everybody, but those are the beginning guys that put up the numbers and win the games. That's right. And that's what the NFL is looking for.
7-8 yards. I mean? Go ahead and play your cover 3. Yep. It's going to be 2nd and 3 all day long.
Yep. Somebody asked, did Tate Martell have an absolute cannon as well? I never thought Tate Martell was that talented. I never thought.
That was the one kid that Urban took out of high school. I'm like, what are you doing?
Oh, he knew exactly what he was doing. It's because Tate was a real popular kid in the class. That's exactly what he did.
He wanted the kid to get the other kids.
Yeah, exactly. And that's absolutely what he did. Because when you go back and look at Tate Martell and who Ohio State signed, you got to remember who they brought in years before. Right. So they were feeling pretty good about where they were at quarterback in year before. They had this kid named Dwayne Haskins on the roster who was in the 2016 class. So, yeah, they were in good position. They had signed this kid named Joe Burrow the year before that they liked a lot. So they knew that they were good at quarterback. They brought in Tate Martell for the recruiting impact. No question about it. No question about it. That was an easy one. So that's those are my thoughts on the quarterback class. Good question. Brian, anybody else that you kind of saw that you've seen that just really stands out as like a guy that you need to talk about? There's some guys here and there that have some ability. I'll tell you, I don't think he's a great prospect, but I thought it was a really good pickup. Stanford getting Elijah Brown was a really nice pickup. He can run that offense pretty well.
He plays at Modern Day. I mean, he's going to be
exactly.
They got better than you or I thought they were going to get.
Yes. That was again. Is he a top 10 quarterback for me? Probably not. But
I bet he starts 2 years at Stanford.
For Stanford, really good pick. And I'll tell you another guy that's not in my top 10 in this class that everybody else hypes up and I don't understand is Jaden Davis. I do not get that one.
He was awful at the Elite 11.
His film's not even that great to me. I do not understand the infatuation people
funky.
have. Well, and I don't mind a funky throwing motion if you can get the ball where it's supposed to go to, but he doesn't get the ball where it's supposed to go to.
He was supposed to throw a bunch of those passes.
Exactly.
The poor guy in the stands got dunked. Okay.
Exactly.
It was bad.
Exactly.
So whatever.
I don't get that one. Like there's this debate, like who got the better quarterback, Ohio State or Michigan? It's not even a debate.
No, I was not the Elite 11 when they went one to the other. 99.9% of the time, Air made the throw and he didn't.
Yes. And Brian, and that's Elite 11. It's fun to watch. I don't care. But the thing is, that translates to the exactly both of them.
He's just more accurate.
I don't care that Air went to Elite 11 tore it up. I didn't need the Elite 11 to tell me that Air Nolan is smart and accurate as a quarterback. I saw that already on film. I didn't need that. I didn't need them to tell me, oh, CJ Carr is really smart and accurate. I already knew that, right? I also didn't need them to tell me that Jaden Thomas doesn't have a great feel for playing quarterback. I didn't need to tell me that either because what that was just the rest of the high school football analysts that have been hyping this kid up, seeing what you and I had already seen on film, and be like, this kid ain't it. This kid ain't it. So that one made very little sense to me. It really did. But I'd take Aaron Noland over him any day of the week. Who was your favorite quarterback for John Elway to face off against in the 80s and then the 90s? Dan Marino. That's who it was, because everybody kept trying to be like, Dan Marino's better than John Elway. And no, he's not. And that's why I always enjoyed it when the Broncos and Dolphins played each other. So, because in the games that mattered, the Broncos always won. So, yeah, that was one for me. I hated it when they played Joe Montana, because you knew Joe Montana was also always coming with a great team. That was never fun. But he even got Elway 1 year in the playoffs in Brian when he was with Kansas City. So, yeah.
Montana was as clutch a quarterback in clutch moments as there's ever been.
Yep. I'm trying to look at this here and look at some of the results that they had when they played each other. So I'm trying to see playoffs. Where can I see playoffs? We'll see the date. So it looks like here, the 85. Looks like the Dolphins beat them in the regular season. In 98. I don't know. This thing is weird to look at, but I know that when they played in the playoffs in 1998, that Denver smoked them. This looks backwards, so I can't figure this out. But yeah, that's who I want them to play. They didn't play very often, but that's who I wanted them to play. I just love the fact that in John Elway's last season, he got to go against Marino in the playoffs, and they destroyed him. That always made me a little happy. And I like Dan Marino. It was more about people just hating on, saying he was better than John Elway. I just never thought that he was.
Somebody just asked in the chat what I think about Cole Mullins. Real quick, Mullins is a really good football player, plays for a great coach. I've met his coach, great guy. I think he'll eventually grow into a strong side end, but he can play a lot of different roles in the 3-3-5 defense. He fits it well. And I bet you money he plays on special teams pretty much from day one.
Sure. I do not get the ranking and the offer list for Cole Mullins. I do not understand it.
And he plays in Gwinnett.
That's Brian. That's the thing. We talked about this in my show yesterday. I know you heard it, but it's just like usually with a kid, you can look at and say, okay, I get why this kid's underranked because he's raw and there's this and there's that. You can usually identify,
even
if you don't agree with it, you can at least understand why a guy may not be ranked as high. That one is just one I just do not understand. And I went off a little bit about that yesterday. I just do not understand. Next question is from Brandon Plesner. Who's the next strong side end in the rotation behind Nana and Javonte Jean-Baptiste now that Aaronsberger is gone? I just don't see Nana bringing much impact there. See, you keep saying this about Nana, Brandon, and I understand where you're coming from, but you're missing the point of what Nana brings to the table. He doesn't bring impact to the table. You don't need your number 2 field end to be an impact guy. If he is great, but not many teams are putting the second guy out there and he's impact. But what Nana is a very steady, stout edge run defender that's going to give you some quality edge run snaps. That's what you're getting from him. You're not putting him in there to be Khalid Kareem. You're putting him in there to say, do your job for 15 to 20 snaps a game. And that's what he does. And he does it. Well, he'll have a snap here, snap there where he gets buried. And I get all that because he's a tad undersized. But Nana, if you understand what his role is, he does his role pretty well. Is he an impact player? No. But he's also a rotation guy, in my opinion, not a starter. Who will be the next guy in there? It's a great question. I mean, obviously, we'll see what kind of offseason Aiden Gobira has. We'll see what kind of offseason Tyson Ford has. Does he fully move inside? I think that he will. But this is where, Brandon, to your point, part of my conversation comes into play about the freshmen. Because there's an opportunity for one of those kids to come in and seize that number 3 job and then potentially get some minutes to where at some point in time in the season they could make plays. So I think you'll end up seeing one of the freshmen win that job, and that's where my prediction from earlier comes into play. Next question from John A1. Did Rubio gain some of his athleticism after being injured his first year? Is there more of a chance now for him to reach his potential that he showed as a high school prospect? Brian, did you get a chance to watch any of the spring game? Did you have a chance to watch Gabriel, I should say, any during the spring game? I think he's getting closer to being the athlete that he was. His motor has always been good, but he's got a little bit better burst at the snap, a little bit better closing speed. I think you'll see him. I would say yes to John's question. Do I think he'll look more like the guy that they recruited in high school? I think so. I do.
I think he's a guy that deserves a lot of reps, if that's what you mean. There was no part of the spring game that made me say, man, he might lose his second string spot.
And we missed on that guy. Right. Exactly.
Sometimes you watch a kid and you're like, he didn't really get any better. This may not end up well.
Yeah.
And he's still, again, there's only so many guys that are 290 plus.
Yeah, and he's up to 302 now and looked quicker than he was a year ago, which is a positive.
So I'm hoping that he takes that next step between now and the season, conditioning and all those little things. He can give him 15 to 20 snaps a game where he's a productive player, maybe 23, 24. And
the sources I've talked to think he's going to be more disruptive this year because he has been. Well, he's quicker. Really his conditioning is better. That he can give them 5-6 tackles for loss off the bench. Now we'll see if he can get there, but that would be huge. To your point, you were going to say it, Brian. That would if you can get disruption production in those 15, 20 snaps from your number 2-3 technique, it's huge.
Yeah, because let's be honest, most teams that Notre Dame plays, their starting nose guard or 3 tech are at best Rubio. And most teams probably don't even have that. Notre Dame can rotate those guys in. It's not who you have. It's a combination of who you have and who they have too. Notre Dame is going to have the depth to rotate guys a lot better than most teams they play.
Brian, I'm so glad you said that because that's part of my optimism for this team. Now,
thank God for
yes, is their roster to the point where I'm like, no, bring on Georgia. Bring on – no, they got some stuff to prove there. But their roster is such where it's like, guys, Notre Dame has backups that would be starters for 9 or 10 teams that they're going to play this year, depending on the position. But defensive line, there are guys on their defensive line that would be starters at just about every school that they're going to play this year other than Ohio State and Clemson on the D-line, right? I mean, that's just the reality of it. And so I said, man, there's just no excuse for them not to be, for all the complaining that Notre Dame fans do about Notre Dame linebackers, there's really not many teams on their schedule that have better linebacker play than they do. There's nobody on their schedule with better corners than they have. So that's where you get down to and say, man, this team needs to be really good. Now, championship good remains to be seen. Some guys that haven't proven themselves need to prove themselves if this team is going to be that good. But that's why I get down to it and say this needs to be an at worst 10-2 team, at worst this year because of the caliber of their schedule. Jason Onye and Gabriel Rubio and Junior Tuihalamaka and Nana Osafa-Mensah is a better starting defensive line than at least half of the teams that Notre Dame is going to play this year. At least half.
There's the main point. Yep.
So what team that's not true of? Duke has a surprisingly good defensive line.
Really?
Dwayne Carter's turned into a really good player for them. They got Jamion Franklin playing a lot for them. He's a former Notre Dame kid. Great kid. Love Jamion. He's turned out to be, what I hoped he would be and thought he would be. But Duke actually has to remember they've had a couple good D-lines before. Remember they had that D-line in 19 with Chris Rumpf and Victor Dimakiji, I think as you say his name. So surprising, they've actually had some decent defensive lines. They get those undersized 6'2", 6'3 kids that nobody wants because they're 6'2 or 6'3. And so like Dwayne Carter was like 6'2 and a half, 260 coming out of Pickerington Central. Duke got him. And he goes down there, and now he's an all-ACC caliber kid.
15 minutes from Ohio State's campus.
That's right. So there's some really good players, but just from a pure talent standpoint, I mean, that's where you look at and say, no, so my buddy's like, well, I think you got to accept 9-3. No, I don't. I don't have to accept 9-3 because the roster is not a 9-3 roster. That means you lost to every good team you played, or you lost to 2 of the good teams you played, and you lost to somebody you shouldn't have. But there are not more than 9 teams on this schedule that have a better roster than Notre Dame. There just aren't, in my opinion. There just aren't. Last couple, we're getting down here to the end. Nathan Milton said, Brian, anything from your sources on Aiden Kaneana? Not yet, but again, I'm very early in my infancy stages of getting all the intel that I'm hoping to get. That's why we haven't put anything on the board yet. But so you guys understand, about middle to like late June, I'll start reaching out to sources and trying to get intel on kids. And then I kind of build that up over the course of the summer. And then hopefully by like mid to late July, I'll have an intel piece where I've been able to gather a bunch of information. But the only place to find that, Brian, is on the message board, everybody, boards.breakdown.com. That's where all that stuff's going to be. We're not going to be sharing it here. It's going to all be on a message board. So we're going to have some fun with it. Let's get to the next one. Archer 452, 24/7 put out the best records against teams ranked since 2000. What is the more surprising, Michigan not being in the top 10 or Stanford being number 9? Stanford being number 9 is not surprising to me at all. If you look at the fact that, number one, not only did Jim Harbaugh win and David Shaw win a ton of ranked games against ranked opponents from like 2010 to 2017 when Stanford was like ranked every year, but they had a couple big upsets when they weren't good. Remember the year that Stanford won, like the year that Notre Dame in 2007,
Yep.
Notre Dame, who was terrible that year, they went 3-9 that year. And part of it was because UCLA played like their third string quarterback.
Yeah, they were terrible at quarterback. Everybody got hurt.
Yeah, and they had like Maurice Crum, like returns a fumble. I can't remember if he scored a touchdown or got it inside the 5. Like they shouldn't have won that game. Duke was just was even worse than Notre Dame was. And then they beat Stanford. That Stanford team that year that went 4-8 beat number 2 USC at USC.
They were underdogs by 41 points.
Yeah. So Harbaugh started winning some of those upset games like early in his tenure at Stanford. So I'm not surprised at all that Stanford has that kind of record. Remember, even just a couple of years ago, Stanford beat Oregon. The year that Oregon
that was great.
Played for the Pac-12, beat Oregon.
That's right.
So I'm not surprised by them being in the top 9. And I'm also not surprised that Michigan's in the top 10 because Michigan doesn't play a lot of top 25 teams. Every year they play 2 to 3 top 25 teams a year. That's it. And one of those teams has dominated them for the better part of the last 15 years. And I know the Michigan's like all in their feelings about winning the last 2, and I get that. But like, do you all realize that even with winning the last 2, you're still like 3-14 in the last, you know what I mean? Like, I'm actually going to go look this up because it's just an absurd.
Ohio State owned them for a long time.
Oh my God!
Michigan credit for flipping it here the last couple of years too.
Yeah, so like Michigan's won the last 2, but if you go back to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. If you go back to the year 2000 and include that game, Ohio State is 17-4 against Michigan.
That means they won over 80% of their games.
Michigan won in 2000, 2003. They beat them they're 19-5. So let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 17-5. And that includes the last 2 wins. So Michigan won in 2000. They won in 2003. They won in 2011, the year that Ohio State was stunk after Tressel was fired. And then they won the last 2. So even with a 2-game winning streak, they're 5-17 against Ohio State since the year 2000. So I'm not shocked by that at all. That record alone is going to keep them out of the top 10. And the only way to get into the top 10 is if you just dominated all the other opponents that were ranked, and they haven't. So
they've lost to Penn State and Wisconsin.
Yeah, and Michigan and Penn State for the most part, Michigan's had the last couple, but for the most part, what they did in the 2010 since Harbaugh was there is they pretty much rotated. The home team normally won. Since 2000, Notre Dame and Michigan are about 50-50. See, Notre Dame is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Since 2000, Michigan is 8-7 against Notre Dame. So you're basically 50-50. I don't know how many of those Notre Dame teams were ranked. So let's see, 2000 was the 02-03. Notre Dame was not ranked in 03. They beat them. Notre Dame was ranked in 06 when they beat them. They were not ranked in 07. They were not ranked in 09. They were not ranked in 2010. I believe they were ranked in 2011, 13, and 19. So they had 4 wins over a ranked Notre Dame team back then. And then when you look at, let's see here, I'm going to try to find the number of times that Notre Dame beat Michigan when they were ranked. Let's see, football rivalry. Let's get this answer here real quick. So if you look at Notre Dame against them when they're ranked, so since 2000, let's see, Michigan. So Notre Dame, where is that? All right, it doesn't give the other team's ranking on that, so I have to find that one. But anyway, here, let's do it this way, Brian. So when did they play? They played in 2002. So let's go to Notre Dame 2002. And I believe that they were ranked that year. Notre Dame won. So Notre Dame beat number 7 Michigan. So that's 1-0 for Notre Dame. In 2003, number 5 Michigan beat number 19 Notre Dame. So that's 1-1. 2004, Notre Dame was not ranked. So Michigan won, but Notre Dame was not ranked because we're talking about against top 25 teams. The next year, in 2005, number 20 Notre Dame beat number 3 Michigan. So that's 2-1. The next year, Michigan beat Notre Dame. Notre Dame was number 2. Michigan was number 11. So it's 2-2. Notre Dame was not ranked in 07. Notre Dame in 2008, neither team was ranked. 2009, Notre Dame was ranked 18th and Michigan beat them. So that's 2-3 for Notre Dame, 2-3. 2010, neither team was ranked. 2011, Notre Dame was not ranked. 2012, Notre Dame was ranked 11th. They beat Michigan, who was ranked 18. Michigan was ranked 18. Yeah, Notre Dame was 11. So that's 3-3. 2013, Notre Dame was ranked 14th. Michigan beat them. So that's 3-4. 2014, let's see here. Michigan was not ranked when Notre Dame beat them 31-0. 2015, I don't think they played. 2016, they didn't play. 2017, they didn't play. 2018, they played. Notre Dame beat them. Notre Dame beat number 14 Michigan, and then so that makes them 4-4. And then Michigan beat a ranked Notre Dame team in 2009. So they're 5-4 against Notre Dame. They're slightly over 50-50 against Michigan. So again, or Penn State. So again, how many ranked teams are they playing outside of that? Some Wisconsin some years or Iowa some years. So the point is, when you're 50-50 against Notre Dame and Ohio State and Penn State, even if you win the Michigan State series, which they didn't control that series either, for a good chunk of the last decade, and you're 5-17 against Ohio State, you're not going to be a top 10 team against ranked opponents. That's just the reality of it. So, yeah. Somebody said there too, don't forget that Michigan ducked Ohio State in 2020. And yeah, they did. They absolutely did. So, yeah. Irish Gordy, not. What do you weigh more when grading quarterbacks, projecting for college? Measurables, arm strength, arm talent, accuracy, release, mental awareness, competitiveness, and leadership. The answer to that is yes. I mean, it's all part of the equation, though, right? I mean, I don't know that I weigh – I think the one that I would probably put near in the bottom half is arm strength for college.
100%, especially for college.
Yeah, it might actually be of these things.
I would put it last.
The bottom. Yeah.
I would put mental awareness number 1 because that's usually what separates. Like Deshaun Watson knew when to take hole shots and stuff like that.
Yep.
There's a feel to that.
Of those 3, Brian, the ones that I would put at the top. Mental awareness,
number 1.
Leadership, competitiveness, all would be at the top. And then after that, it comes down to arm talent. Because see, some of those, like arm talent and accuracy, go hand in hand.
It's almost the same thing.
You can't have accuracy. You can't have arm talent if you don't have accuracy. Now, to his question, arm strength and accuracy are 2 completely different things. But arm talent to me is accuracy. It is a repeatable release. Repeatable doesn't mean same angle. You can be a guy that changes angles, but you can repeat and be accurate out of all of them. Those 2 things to me go with arm talent. And I'd also say competitiveness and leadership are kind of one thing to me. Like if you're you can be a competitive guy and not a great leader, but if you're a great leader, you can't be a great leader and not be competitive. Like because then you're not a leader, you're not competitive. That's an utter lack of leadership. Someone who's not competitive. So I put those 2 together. And those are number 2, and then arm talent would be then number 3 because accuracy and release are part of arm talent. Thoughts on that, Brian?
If I had to rank them, I mean, mental awareness to me is especially number 1. If you want to, again, how you want to rank it is goofy, but accuracy in some capacity got to be up there, and then that competitiveness and leadership. If you've got a consistent motion and you're a smart kid, that leadership and competitiveness comes in really big, because football today, with everybody shoving a microphone in front of your face and stuff like that, when to say something, when not to, that's part of leadership. There's so many things. Man, I know having the big arm's fun, but that it's not the same, man. A lot of the best guys with arm strength end up sucking.
Right.
It's just not.
And that's what makes guys like Bryce Young so special.
Yeah, he has a good
because not only does he
arm,
have a
but it's
big
not
arm,
great.
but in the mental release and he had mental awareness, he had arm talent, he was accurate, had a great release. He's also a great leader. You know, he had the competitiveness as well. There's a lot of 5-star quarterbacks that aren't going to be willing to sit behind Mac Jones for a year. It's not going to do it. They're up and transfer. And when they get beat out in the spring, they're going to transfer. And he didn't. He took it as, okay, well, I'm not happy about it, but how am I going to learn? And then you've got guys that have all the arm talent in the world, and I wouldn't take them on my team. Like everybody keeps saying, man, if only Deshaun Kaiser would have come back in 2017, pass. He would have had to have a completely different – he'd had to have a personality transplant that offseason before I would have wanted him back as my quarterback in 2017. Like, simple as that. Like, yeah, no, Brandon Wimbush was not the passer, but you know what Brandon was in 2017? A much better leader than Deshaun was, which is why that team came together. It's not a coincidence that basically the same team in 2017 went 10-3 with Brandon and went 4-8 with Deshaun at quarterback. Or was he at 4-8? Yeah.
Bingo.
So that stuff matters, man. And I would argue Deshaun Kaiser had more arm talent than Malik Zaire, but there's a reason that team was so much more effective when Malik was their quarterback, is because he had the other traits, the competitiveness, the leadership. Players wanted to play for him. That was a big difference between those two guys. If we're talking NFL prospects, it's not even close. Deshaun's a much better NFL prospect than Malik was. But I'll take Malik, a healthy Malik, over Deshaun as my starting college quarterback any day of the week. And that's something that a lot of people that covered the team missed in 2016 when they kept trying to say Deshaun's the guy, Deshaun's the guy. No. You're obsessing over arm talent. I want a guy that wins and that's competitive, that's a leader, that the players want to play for. And that's so important in college, man. So important in college. This last question is going to be for you, Brian. Patrick King says, what was the true story behind why Randy Moss, number one all time for me, did not get a chance or was unable to play for Notre Dame? This question's been asked a few times recently. I was like, I need to wait until Brian's on the show to get some of the backstory on this. Because it's a combination of factors.
Yeah,
right?
I did a podcast on my own little thing about this recently. I was told all of the following. Take it for whatever you want to do. His application was incomplete in pencil and 2 types of ink. How accurate that is, I don't know. But that's never a good start. It was also late. He got in trouble with a fight where he beat the crap out of a guy. And he'd already, his attitude was never good. His grades were borderline at best. If he hadn't been Randy Moss, he wouldn't have even got to that point. Mm-hmm. He's the best prospect I've ever seen on film, and that's the end of the discussion. So
if he doesn't have the fight, he's at Notre Dame.
He wouldn't have lasted probably, but yeah, they were willing to get convinced.
Right.
But that was like okay, look, this kid's not coming to our campus, and we're not getting sued over him or something. That was it.
Yeah. They lost him, 2 huge losses that year. They lost him and James Jackson that year.
Actually, there's 3.
Who's the third?
Oh, he was pretty good. You ready? You're sitting down, so I'll tell you. Javon Curse.
Oh, I knew that one. I'm talking about guys that had signed with Notre Dame, because James Jackson signed with Notre Dame. I actually told this story recently, Brian. Alex Mueller.
Yeah, no. Yeah, he's the guy who got the scholarship supposed to go to Curse. Curse just waited too long.
Yeah. Yep. I know a lot of people have said Allen Iverson was never going to come to Notre Dame because he was never going to play football. Well, he was never going to play football.
Yeah.
That's the thing. He was going to play basketball. He was always going to be a basketball player.
And he should have.
Yes, exactly.
That was okay.
And I'll say this, and I know Allen Iverson was great at football, but the best high school football player I've played against Plexico Burris, I've played against
Ronald Curry.
Bly. It's not even close.
Yeah.
I mean, people say, why did nobody ever hear about Michael Vick? Because he played in the same league as Ronald Curry. That's why nobody knew who the heck Michael Vick. When Curry, you're not even the best player in your high school league, you know what I mean?
What happened to Curry?
Not even the injury. It was him choosing to go to North Carolina instead of Florida State or Michigan. That's really what it boiled down to. He chose the basketball school because Boove Williams convinced him he was a basketball player. Ronald Curry had no left hand as a basketball player. He was just a great athlete. He had no left hand to speak of. He was not a basketball. He was a great high school basketball player because he was just so much more athletic than everybody else. If Ronald Curry would have committed to football, and I love the fact that he's a college, an NFL assistant coach and all that now, because I think the world of Ronald Curry, and I'm glad he's having success. And he ended up playing the NFL as a wide receiver, which tells you about his athleticism. After a torn Achilles, he became an NFL wide receiver. If Ronald Curry would have made the decision to even go to Virginia Tech, but if he would have gone to Florida State, or because he would have been playing for Mark Richt his first couple years. He would have been the quarterback over Chris Weinke on those championship teams. There's no doubt in my mind. Or he would have replaced Weinke. But if he would have gone to Florida State or Michigan, those are the other two teams he wanted to go play for, and committed to football, he'd have been the number 1 overall draft pick, in my opinion, at quarterback. I truly believe that. Because he was a freaky athlete, but he was a natural passer. Ronald had an arm. I watched him in a high school. You remember Deion Dyer? Remember him, played in North Carolina? I remember I was a senior and Ronald was a junior. And I had heard all this stuff, and I thought I was a pretty good player. And like I said, I played against Dre Bly. I played against Plexico Burrs. I'm like, all right, let me go check out this Ronald Curry guy. And I watched him play. This is when he was a junior. And they're playing Deep Creek. And I think that Deep Creek team had like 7 or 8 guys that went and played D1 football. This is back when Deep Creek was really good. And our area was loaded that year. James Boyd, remember, he started at Penn State for a few years at State. He was in the league. We played them in the playoffs my sophomore year, and they beat us. But I went and watched him play against Deep Creek in the playoffs. And he had 3 touchdown passes. He had a rushing touchdown on like a 50-yard option play. He had a 75-yard punt return for a touchdown, and he picked off a pass and ran it back for a touchdown. And his shortest touchdown pass was like 9 yards, but he threw it from like the 40 because he kept running backwards like they were trying to chase him, and he escapes them, and from like the 35, 40-yard line just flicks the ball into the back of the end zone. I think he might have hit like Bobby Blizzard with the ball or something like that. And you're just like watching, like this guy is – this guy's on such a different level than everyone I've ever played with or against. And I'm telling you, I played against some guys that were really freaking good. And I'm like, this guy makes us all look like children. I mean, he was just the most unbelievable football player I've ever seen in my life. And I still, and I'm talking about being at the Army All-American games and everything I've seen with my own eyes. Ronald Curry was an unbelievable player. He just made the wrong decision. This is why it's so important. You got to pick the right school, man. And he was convinced he was a basketball player. And if he would have stuck with football, man. So Ronald Curry and Randy Moss, to me, are the 2 best high school football players I've ever seen in my life. And Randy Moss's high school film is insane. I mean, it is. And his college highlights were every bit as insane. But would he have made it at Notre Dame? Probably not, for the same reason he didn't last at Florida State.
He was going to smoke weed no matter what.
Yeah. So it is what it is. All right, Brian, that's going to do it for today's show. Great job today, man. So I really appreciate you being with me today. This was a lot of fun. We're going to be back tomorrow. I think it's going to be me and Vince tomorrow on Friday for our Notre Dame football mailbag. In 20 minutes, you guys are going to have an IB Nation Sports Talk show with Sean Stiers. You're going to definitely want to check that out. If you have not done so, sign up for the boards at boards@irishbreakdown.com. We'd greatly appreciate that. And, of course, sign up for the CFB or go subscribe to the CFB Nation channel. You guys will enjoy that very much. And have a great rest of your day. We thank you all for being with us. Love talking D-line. That mailbag was forever. Didn't feel like it, but, man, we went like 2 hours on that mailbag. Some great questions today, everybody. And, of course, Brian, next week we're going to launch Brian's show at CFB Nation. It's going to be we're going to talk about Southeastern recruiting. He's going to have a road show during the season. He and I will do some shows where we talk about national recruiting, college football in general. July is going to be a much busier month on the CFB Nation channel for sure. So you're going to make sure you subscribe to our podcast app for that. So for Brian, I'm also Brian. You all have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you again very soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.